If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. The most terrifying local legends, folklore, fairy encounters, and mythical creature horror stories you've never heard before that will give you nightmares. I've always been interested in folklore because it's quite telling of the local culture, and I was wondering what it's like near you. Local legends are always good, too, because they can be fascinating but not get much exposure. I live near Hebden Bridge, Yorkshire, UK, and the main industry around here has always involved shepherds and textiles, so people used to spend a lot of time on the moors. This means there's quite a bit of folklore surrounding the area's stones and landforms. For example, there's a large glacial area known as Devil's Rock. It got its name because, apparently, God had a bet with the devil over who could control the valley. The bet was that whoever could step across would win. Naturally, God emerges victorious, while the devil struggles, ultimately pushing the land up with his foot and creating the rock. There's also a way marker on the moors called Churn Milk Jones. According to the story, there was a girl who worked on a farm and would take butter and other dairy products across the moor to sell in nearby towns. One day she got attacked by a witch and turned into stone. Now the stone is supposed to rotate 3 times clockwise every new year, and people always leave coins and vinegar there as an offering or something. Fun fact, when I was young, I used to have nightmares about the stone floating outside my window. Near Whitby, which is on the coast around 3 hours from me, the landscape is very glacial, with long valleys and erratics everywhere. Legend has it that giants attacked the area, hurling rocks at the coastal towns from inland. God, yes, he reappeared, intervened to safeguard the town, ensuring that all the rocks they hurled fell short. The erratics are the stones they threw, which makes sense as the rock is the same as stone found much further inland where the top of the glacier would have been, or where the giants were standing, and the large glacial valleys are where the flying rocks pushed up the land. Around Sheffield there is a hill called Hail Mary Hill, and there is a cave at the top apparently containing a large chest of money. However, a large black cat guards the chest. Interestingly, sightings of large black cats around the moors are quite common in the area, and the chest is so heavy that no rope can move it. I'm from Michigan, here are a few. Knock Knock Road is in the Detroit area. Supposedly, if you drive along at night, a young girl will tap on your car window searching for the motorist that hit and killed her while she was riding her bike. In the Upper Peninsula, there are 2 notable landmarks, the Dog Man, which is self-explanatory, and the Paulding Light, a light that floats on a stretch of road. Detroit also has the Nine Rouge, which is said to be a sort of harbinger of doom, usually seen right before something really bad happens. The Three-Legged Lady of Nash Road. The legend of the Three-Legged Lady is by far one of the creepiest urban legends associated with Mississippi. For years, locals have told the story of the phantom woman and the lonely stretch of road she haunts. According to legend, the Three-Legged Lady haunts Nash Road, which is not far from the Lock and Dam in Columbus, Mississippi. But the Three-Legged Lady doesn't just haunt the area, she torments drivers by chasing their cars down the dark roadway. As the story goes, motorists who want to see the Three-Legged Lady should stop on Nash Road, turn off the headlights, and honk the horn 3 times. After doing so, the Three-Legged Lady knocks on the roof of the car and then races the driver to the end of the road, hitting the car with her body the entire time. Some say the Three-Legged Lady of Nash Road was secretly seeing a Civil War veteran who was ended and cast off Nash Road Bridge by the lady's husband when their fidelity was discovered. The veteran's leg was snagged on the fall down and separated from his body. Some claim that, in a fit of grief, the lady recovered this leg, sewed it onto her own body, and haunted the church where his funeral was held following her own death. Others tell of an even more tragic story, where the Lady of Nash Road was the wife of a farmer, whose visits into town became more and more frequent to the point of suspicion. The women at her church would laugh at her, knowing that she wasn't enough for her husband, which angered her greatly. The wife followed him into town one day to discover that he was indeed cheating on her. That night, she whipped up a special dinner involving poison, which promptly killed the husband. The people of church began to whisper about her having potentially ended her husband after several weeks of his absence and excuses that no longer pacified. Knowing that she was on borrowed time, the Lady of Nash Road barred the exit to the church one Sunday morning during service and set the building ablaze, watching excitedly as those who so loved to gossip about her got their comeuppance. She sewed the leg of her dead husband to her body so that they could be together for eternity and is said to haunt the charred church grounds and kill anyone who trespasses upon them. The Bell Witch from American Urban Legends. The Bell Witch or Bell Witch haunting is a legend from southern United States folklore, centered on the 19th century Bell family of northwest Robertson County, Tennessee. Farmer John Bell Sr. resided with his family along the Red River near the town of Adams. According to legend, From 1817 to 1821, his family and the local area were attacked by a mostly invisible entity that was able to speak, affect the environment, and shapeshift. Some accounts record the spirit also to have been clairvoyant and capable of crossing long distances with superhuman speed. The haunting began sometime in 1817, when John witnessed the apparition of a strange creature resembling a dog. Bell fired at the animal, but it disappeared. John's son Drew approached an unknown bird perched on a fence that flew off and was of huge size. The daughter Betsy observed a girl in green dress swinging from the limb of an oak tree. Dean, a person enslaved by the Bell family, reported being followed by a large black dog on evenings he visited his wife. Activity moved to the Bell household with knocking heard along the door and walls. The family heard sounds of gnawing on the beds, invisible dogs fighting, and chains along the floor. About this time, John Bell began experiencing paralysis in his mouth. The phenomenon grew in intensity as sheets were pulled from beds when the children slept. Soon the entity pulled hair and scratched the children, with particular emphasis on Betsy, who was slapped, pinched, and stuck with pins. The Bells turned to family friend James Johnston for help. After retiring for the evening at the Bell home, Johnston was awakened that night by the same phenomena. That morning he told John Bell it was a spirit, just like in the Bible. When asked who it was, it tied its origin to an ancient Native American burial ground being disturbed. The story climaxes with the Bell patriarch being poisoned by the witch. Afterward, the entity interrupted the mourners by singing. Subsequently, the entity told the family it was going to leave but return in 7 years, in 1828. The witch returned on time to Lucy and her sons Richard and Joel with similar activities as before, but they chose not to encourage it, and she appeared to leave again. Darwin. I used to live in a house on the edge of the swamp area in Bayview. Gorgeous house, we were so happy to move in. But after a while it had a vibe, a not so nice one. We often heard noises, which I know can probably be explained. But something was just off. We started to notice that my toddler's toys would often roll towards her. This happened on several occasions. My toddler always seemed to be playing with someone who wasn't there. Always noticed things out of the corner of my eye. The night we decided to move my daughter to her own room and out of ours was the worst though. She seemed fine in there, but I just couldn't shake the feeling. I struggled to sleep that night but, at about 2 a.m., woke from a nightmare that my daughter was possessed in her cot. I went to check on her, and she was standing quietly in the cot, not crying, which was so odd. The room smelled of garbage. Strong garbage like at the tip. I was so freaked out that we moved her cot back into our room that instant. Moved out of the house 2 weeks later. My husband and I were so scared that we made sure not to talk about it while we were home because we didn't want whatever it was to know. Bay of Onth from Scottish folklore. The Bay of Onth is a female vampire in the folklore of the Scottish Highlands, though they also share certain characteristics in common with the succubus and fairy. They appear as beautiful women who seduce their victims before attacking them and draining their blood. According to the folklore, the Bay of Onth usually appears as a beautiful young woman wearing a long green dress that conceals the deer hooves she is instead of feet. Like other vampires, she drinks the blood of human victims and vanishes with the rising sun. She may also transform into a hooded crow or raven. There are numerous stories about the Bay of Onth with a general theme of hunters being attacked in the wilderness at night. In one tale, there were 4 men who went hunting and sheltered for the night in a lonely shieling or hut. One of the men supplied vocal music while the others began dancing. The men expressed a desire for partners to dance with, and soon after that, 4 women entered the hut. 3 of them danced while the 4th sat beside the vocalist. He then noticed drops of blood falling from his companions and fled from the hut, taking refuge among the horses. His vampiric partner chased him but was unable to catch him, and when daylight came, she disappeared. The man went back inside and found all 3 of his friends dead and drained of blood. It is suggested that the Bay of Onth was unable to catch the 4th man among the horses because of the iron with which the horses were shod, iron being a traditional fairy vulnerability. In another story, the hunters took refuge in a cave. Each of the men said he wished his own sweetheart were there that night, but one of them, named McPhee, who was accompanied by his black dog, said he preferred his wife to remain at home. At that moment, a group of young women entered the cave, and the men who had wished for their sweethearts were killed. McPhee was protected by his dog, who drove the women from the cave. One recurring motif in these stories is that the Bay of Onth appear almost immediately after the hunters express their desire for female companionship. This is connected with a traditional Scottish belief that if one were to make a wish at night without also invoking God's protection, then that wish would be granted in some terrible manner. Striga from Albanian mythology. A Striga is a vampiric witch in Albanian mythology and folklore that sucks the blood of infants while they sleep and then turns into a flying insect. Only Striga herself could cure those she had drained. The Striga is often pictured as a woman with a hateful stare, sometimes wearing a cape, and a horribly disfigured face. They usually live in hidden places in the forest and have supernatural powers. The term Striga is also used with the common meaning of witch, referring to a bad and ugly old woman who casts evil spells on people. Finland. In the other world called Metson, a sort of mirrored pocket dimension, lived hairy humanoid creatures that collect human infants as changelings and replace them with their own. These creatures have many names, such as Monvaki, Mahinen, Meninkainen, Heidenvaki, Hizi, and Pico. Their kind also includes Tontu and Haltia, but these live in this world and help people instead. These are also spirits of nature that are everywhere and in everything, and in the old days they were believed to hear everything, see everything, and know everything, and can get fatally angry and kill if you make even a small sound like whistling, whispering, sneezing, or knocking, because they were said to love absolute peace and silence. However, you could appease them with food motifs and apologizing. Enraged beings could also impart a disease, the Manvia, wrath of the earth, which appeared, for example, as pain. Their water-dwelling counterpart is the Naki or Vithinen, also Vizihizi or Videnvaki, which lurks its prey/victim beneath the surface and then drowns it at the bottom of a lake, pond, or river if the person going to the shore or walking on the ice is too careless or falls for their lures and baits. These have been described more as frog-like creatures that were covered in pondweed and burrweed. Then they raise human children as their livestock and eat them. The Metson was also not safe, and you could accidentally get lost there, and it was difficult to find your way out. The one lost there could see the searchers, but the one lost to them was invisible to others and could be missing from days to years. Sure, a special spell could be performed to get out of there more easily, but that didn't guarantee the return of the lost. Those who returned were said to have suffered from dizziness, confusion, and memory loss, or they could go completely insane. These stories are probably meant to remind us that nature has sometimes been a scary, unpredictable, and dangerous place, and to warn about it. Mine would be Näcken. It's an old Swedish myth. Näcken roughly translates to the naked one, and it's a demon/wood spirit that would transform into an extremely beautiful young man and play the fiddle by streams or lakes. In some stories, he is quite evil and lures children and young women and drowns them. Sort of a soul collector for Satan. In other stories, people would leave their fiddle on a rock by the waters where Näcken had been seen. Näcken would, if you were lucky, come up from the water and tune your fiddle, and by doing that, give you the power to play like no mortal man could. There is also a great amount of old tunes in Nordic folk music tradition called Näcken tunes, where you tune your fiddle in a special way. The legend says that these tunes were passed down from people who learned to play from Näcken. Chushka from Scottish folklore. The chushka is a water spirit in Scottish folklore, known as the Ishka in Ireland and Cabalashti on the Isle of Man. It usually takes the form of a horse and is similar to the Kelpie, but far more vicious. The chushka, a supernatural water horse found in the Scottish Highlands, has been described as perhaps the fiercest and most dangerous of all the water horses. Often mistaken for the Kelpie, which inhabits streams and rivers, the chushka lives in the sea lochs, and freshwater lochs. The chushka is a shapeshifter, disguising itself as a fine horse, pony, a handsome man, or an enormous bird such as a booby. If, while in horse form, a man mounts it, he is only safe as long as the chushka is ridden in the interior of land. However, the merest glimpse or smell of water means the beginning of the end for the rider, for the chushka's skin becomes adhesive, and the creature immediately goes to the deepest part of the loch with its victim. After the victim has drowned, the chushka tears him apart and devours the entire body except for the liver, which floats to the surface. In its human form, it is said to appear as a handsome man and can be recognized as a mythological creature only by the water weeds or profuse sand and mud in its hair. Because of this, people in the highlands were often wary of lone animals and strangers by the water's edge, near where the chushka was reputed to live. Along with its human victims, cattle and sheep were also often prey to the chushka, and it could be lured out of the water by the smell of roasted meat. In one account, a man who was about to be carried by the water horse into the loch was able to save himself by placing both feet on either side of a narrow gateway the horse was running through, thereby wrenching himself off its back through sheer force. A boy who had touched the horse with his finger and gotten stuck was able to save himself by cutting it off. In another account, a Highland freebooter encountered a water horse in its human form and fired his gun at it twice with no effect, but when he loaded it with a coin made of silver and fired again, the man retreated and plunged back into the loch. Wisconsin, wendigo, Also prevalent in Minnesota and Canada, wendigos are malevolent spirits. Their name roughly translates to the evil that devours mankind. When a person resorts to cannibalism as a form of sustenance, whether out of desperation, like the Donner Party, or psychosis, like Jeffrey Dahmer, that person becomes vulnerable to possession. Because they've committed the ultimate taboo. The circumstances are irrelevant. This segues into a rather easy possession by the spirit. When the person in question becomes possessed, they're driven into a state of extreme psychosis, always hungry. Then, over time, the spirit consumes the host, specifically their soul, until there's no humanity left in the host. When this happens and the spirit has fully taken over, the person becomes something monstrous. But one can become possessed by the wendigo simply by being in a vulnerable state, be it spiritually or mentally. Not to mention the spirit is capable of influencing people, breaking them down, and even driving them mad, to the point where they may even commit cannibalism, which inevitably leads to possession. Now if this isn't terrifying, then I don't know what is. Kandi from Nepalese folklore. In Nepalese folklore or mythology, Kandi, also referred to as Kandi, is the spirit of a woman that is latched to an uncremated part of her dead body, usually a bone. They are generally known to be solitary spirits that haunt a particular location. Children often grow up hearing the stories of the tortured souls of women who wander the site of their untimely deaths. These women, while alive, were treated unfairly in some manner or died during childbirth or pregnancy. According to sightings, they are supposed to have unusually long black hair, a pale and bony complexion, and be dressed up in a red bridal dress. It is said that they can be identified by looking at their feet, which face backwards. People usually describe them as an alluring, young female who attracts a lonely male traveler and saps their life force. The victims are said to turn out drained of their lives and skinny. According to other tales told by locals and cab drivers, these spirits are also known to hitchhike late at night. When the drivers of the vehicle or motorcycle follow her directions, they end up on cremation grounds in a temple or a cemetery. Skunk Ape from American folklore. The skunk ape, also known as the swamp ape and Florida Bigfoot in American folklore, is a purported ape-like creature that is said to inhabit the forests and swamps of some southeastern United States, most notably in Florida. The skunk ape is commonly described as a bipedal ape-like creature, approximately 1.5 to 2.1 meters, 5 to 7 feet, tall, and covered in mottled reddish-brown hair. The skunk ape is often reported to be smaller in stature compared to traditional descriptions of Bigfoot from the northern US and Canada. It is named for its foul odor, often described as being similar to a skunk. The skunk ape has been a part of Florida, Georgia, and Alabama folklore since the European settler period. Additionally, Seminole culture includes stories of a foul-smelling, physically powerful, and secretive creature called Estikipkaki, a name that roughly translates as cannibal giant. The skunk ape was frequently reported in the 1950s and 1970s. By 1974, sightings of a large, foul-smelling, hairy, ape-like creature that ran upright on two legs were reported in suburban neighborhoods of Miami-Dade County that border large wilderness expanses such as the Everglades and Big Cypress National Preserve, including a corroborated account by two Palm Beach County Sheriff's deputies named Marvin Lewis and Ernie Milner. They reported that a tall, ape-like animal stalked them through a grove before it was fired upon to ward it off. Following a footprint trail, the pair recovered hair snagged on a barbed wire fence line that had been pushed down. Sightings have continued into the current years. In 2015, a video taken by a kayaker named Matthew McCamey at the Lettuce Lake Park in Hillsborough County, Florida, shows an upright, ape-like creature wading through a cypress marsh. The movements and hair of the creature were remarked as realistic, and the location would have made a hoax difficult. Some of South Milwaukee's local legends revolve around the Seven Bridges Trail in Grant Park, on the coast of Lake Michigan. The name of the trail itself is a bit of a misnomer, as I have counted a total of 9 bridges in that segment of the park. I'm not entirely sure why that is. Perhaps only the main loop bridges count towards the total, or perhaps 2 bridges were built at a later date, after the name had stuck. The trail is said to be haunted by all sorts of different ghosts and spectral phenomena. The origin of the legend perhaps comes from Seven Bridges' most prominent, and most photogenic, bridge, which welcomes you into the trail with the words "Enter this wild wood and view the haunts of nature," with people taking the term haunts a bit literally. People have reported seeing colorful ghost lights dancing through the woods and misty apparitions when one stands in the center of one of the bridges. People have reported hearing loud breathing, heavy footsteps running across the bridges, shrieks, screams, and cackles. Legends claim that people have hung themselves from the main bridge. The most detailed ghost legend claims the main ghost there is that of a woman searching for her 2 sons who drowned in Lake Michigan. These hauntings supposedly only occur during the night, when the park is closed and you aren't technically supposed to be in there. I've walked through the park myself a few nights, though sad to say, and the only thing I noticed haunting the Seven Bridges Trail was a pack of stoner teenagers. Regardless, it's a fun legend, though I'm not sure how widespread it is. Before I lived in South Milwaukee, my parents would take me on a hike through Seven Bridges every year in the autumn. Now, as an adult, I've moved into South Milwaukee and hiked the trail much more frequently, and for years I hiked the trail without knowing any of the legends tied to the place. In fact, all my nighttime hikes through the park all occurred before I had heard that ghosts were supposed to appear there at night. There is a camp in the Midwest that has many different ecosystems in close proximity. There is a lake, a marsh, and several miles of forest made up of oak, maple, and birch. However, there is one stretch of the land where only pines grow. They create a barrier from one side of the camp to the other, ending at the crest of a large hill. It's this natural barrier that is said to be home to the pine spirits. Anyone who has frequented this camp knows you do not go to the pines after sundown. At the crest of the hill, there is a small clearing that is a perfect circle. It is here that daring teens go for a glimpse of the pine spirits. They are inhumanly tall, with long limbs that swing when they walk. They stand among the trees, indistinguishable from them until they start to walk. When you see them, a chill creeps up your spine, and you are paralyzed. You can barely breathe until they disappear back into the tree line. I saw them myself, accidentally, one night as I was walking back to my campsite. I always avoided the pines after hearing the stories, but my camp sat right beside them. I wasn't too worried, I thought I would be safe so long as I didn't climb the hill. As my campsite became visible across the open field, the light silhouetted saplings at the edge of the field, near my camp. I thought, that's strange, I don't remember saplings being planted here. Suddenly, the saplings began moving. I realized then I was looking at two horribly long legs and two eerie swinging arms as the pine spirit started slowly walking towards the hill. It felt like there was lead in my feet, I couldn't move. I don't even remember breathing. It wasn't until it was completely out of sight that I found my legs, and I ran to my campsite. I never saw them again, and truly I don't ever want to, and if I'm honest, I have never solo camped since. The Talipo is derived from North American folklore. Talipo is a creature from North American folklore, particularly in Appalachia. The Talipo is usually described as being the size of a dog. Depending upon the native culture of the storyteller, the Talipo is said to have either yellow or red eyes. The Talipo also has pointed ears and a long tail. The main events occur in a dilapidated log cabin deep in the woods, where a hermit and his 3 dogs live. The man is out at night, looking for the evening meal, and manages to shoot a small hare, which he shares with his dogs. Understandably still hungry, the man presses on and discovers a bizarre shape with bright eyes and a long tail. The hermit quickly shoots at the creature, severing its tail. Screaming, the creature runs off into the darkness, and its tail is then taken back and made into a stew or simply eaten by the man. On the brink of sleep, a rustling and clawing wakes the man. Sitting up, the hermit is able to see the gleaming eyes of the Talipo leering at him from the foot of his bed. In an otherworldly voice, the creature demands the return of its Talipo. Terrified, the man calls for his hounds, which immediately come to his aid, chasing the beast off into the night. With the creature chased back into the woods, 2 of the hermit's dogs return, but one is missing. The man tries to sleep, but the Talipo soon returns, beckoning even more forcefully for the return of its tail. Again the man sicks his hounds on the Talipo, and again one is missing upon the return of the survivor. Unable to sleep, the man clutches his gun and waits for dawn, his remaining dog nearby, and it too goes missing when the Talipo appears again. The man, now left with no real protection, having exhausted his 3 hounds, cowers under his bedsheets, praying for dawn. Hours before daybreak, the man hears the familiar rustling sound, hoping it is one of his dogs. Unfortunately, the man is leapt upon by the Talipo and is disarmed in terror. Most commonly, the man is described as being flayed beyond recognition. In less violent versions, the beast is simply said to attack the man with such force that when the sun rises, all that remains of the cabin is the chimney. Either way, it is understood that the Talipo has exacted revenge for the loss of its tail. Supposedly, during the darkest of nights, the creature can be heard whispering for its Talipo. Akushika from Native American folklore. Akushika or Kushtaka are mythical shape-shifting creatures found in the folklore of the Tlingit peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast of North America. They are similar to the Watsa of the Tsimshian people, the Natina of the Dena'ina Native Americans of south-central Alaska, and the Uriuli of the Yupik in western Alaska. Physically, Akushika are shapeshifters capable of assuming human form, the form of an otter, and potentially other forms. In some accounts, Akushika is able to assume the form of any species of otter, in others, only one. Accounts of their behavior seem to conflict with one another. In some stories, Akushika are cruel creatures who take delight in tricking poor Tlingit sailors to their deaths. Others are friendly and helpful, frequently saving the lost by freezing. In many stories, the Akushika save the lost individual by distracting them with curiously otter-like illusions of their family and friends as they transform their subject into a fellow Akushika, thus allowing him to survive in the cold. Naturally, this is counted as a mixed blessing. However, Akushika legends are not always pleasant. In some legends, it is said the Akushika will imitate the cries of a baby or the screams of a woman to lure victims to the river. Once there, the Akushika either kills the person and tears them to shreds or will turn them into another Akushika. Legends have it. Akushika can be warded off through copper, urine, dogs, and, in some stories, fire. It is also said that the Akushika emits a high-pitched, three-part whistle in the pattern of low-high-low. The tale of how Krackow was founded. There once was a small village along the Vistula River. Near this village there was a hill. On the side of the hill, there was a cave. Nobody ever went into the cave, and the elders said that no one should go into the cave because the elders' fathers had once told tales of a dragon that slept in that cave. Unfortunately, a group of youths didn't believe in the myth. To end these stories, they decided to explore the cave and end these rumors and myths. They cleared the overgrown vines and weeds from the cave's entrance and went in. However, they soon came to a dead end. Stopping to rest, the group realized that there was a warm wind coming from deeper in the cave while cold air from the entrance whistled past them regularly. They realized that they could hear heavy breathing and that one of the walls was made of scales. They ran out of the cave as fire licked at their heels. They looked back and watched as the dragon came out of the cave, enraged that it had been woken. From that day on, there was no peace. The dragon would destroy buildings and eat sheep, or young virgins. Several people tried to kill the dragon but failed. However, the shoemaker's apprentice, Krackow, had a clever idea. He made a thick, yellow paste out of sulfur and used it to paint the sheep. He then herded all the sheep to where the dragon would see them. The dragon ate them, and the sulfur made his stomach burn. He ran to the river and began drinking water. No matter how much he drank, the fire in his belly wouldn't stop. He drank so much, he blew up. In Krakkow's honor, a fort was built on the Dragon's Hill. It was named after him, Krackow. I'm from the West Midlands in the UK, and along a main road near the town where I live is an abandoned home known as Madame Pigots' house. The tale varies dramatically. I've heard many versions of the story. The one I'm most familiar with goes like this. Madame Pigot was married to the local squire, who was widely respected by the community. However, he was an abusive and neglectful husband who abandoned his wife when she fell pregnant. When Madame Pigot eventually gave birth to her child, it was stillborn, so thrown into a deep depression, she drowned herself in a nearby lake with her baby in her arms. Before she died, she vowed to kill any man or young son who would come across her home because of the bitterness from the loss of her own child and the betrayal from her husband. Now, I'm not sure how historically true this is, if at all. However, there is truly something very unsettling about the house along that road. I have had a terrible feeling every time I've passed it, even before I knew about the folk tale. Most Haunted apparently went to film there but refused to stay because the activity in the house was so strong. I know that many people have entered the house. The front is inaccessible and covered in keep-out warnings, probably because it's so structurally unstable. But if you cut through Deer Park to the back of the house, there is a hollowed-out window people can climb through. My brother and his friends went in there last week, and he said the place was truly quite scary, regardless of whether it was haunted or not. The whole place has been vandalized heavily, and the upstairs is too dangerous to access because it's falling apart. My brother took pictures inside and out, and in one video he swears he caught a ghost orb on camera. They all decided to leave after they noticed the orb in the footage. His friends were already scared by how incredibly cold the one room of the house was. My brother's glasses had steamed up, despite how hot it was outside and in the other rooms. Shikigami from Japanese folklore. In Japanese folklore, the name Shikigami refers to a being. People believe it to be a small ghost, a form of kami. According to the tradition of Onmyoto, Shikigami is a symbol of Onmyojis, in charge of Oriental divination in ancient Japan, power because Onmyoji can freely use Shikigami with magical powers. It has been associated with curses since the 1000s of the Heian period and was often depicted as a bird or a child in Japanese literature. Shikigami are conjured beings, made alive through a complex conjuring ceremony. Their power is connected to the spiritual force of their master, where if the invoker is well introduced and has much experience, their shiki can possess animals and even people and manipulate them, but if the invoker is careless, their shikigami may get out of control in time, gaining its own will and consciousness, and can even raid its own master and kill them in revenge. Usually shikigami are conjured to exercise risky orders for their masters, such as spying, stealing, and enemy tracking. Shikigami are said to be invisible most of the time, but they can be made visible by binding them into small, folded, and artfully cut paper mannequins. There are also shikigami that can show themselves as animals. In the Izanagi Ryu folk religion, the most elite onmyoji could also conjure an exceptionally powerful type of shikigami called a shikioji to ward off disasters or demons that cause sickness. Regular mystics could not attempt to summon it without risking losing control of it due to its oni type of demon, like nature. Virginia. In my town, there is an old church, built around 1751, that is rumored to be haunted by a woman who was ended by highwaymen during the Revolution. The church shut down during the Revolution, and afterwards her skeleton was found in the belfry with nothing but her blonde hair. People have reported sounds of running up the stairs to the balcony, sounds of a struggle, and sounds of a woman either screaming or crying. They also say sometimes at night you can see a light, almost like a candle, in one of the windows. The church was also used as a hospital during the Civil War and is rumored to be haunted by a Union soldier. The Soul Tree. There was once a graveyard near a house. It was an old graveyard, an old house, to which there was said to be a legend, more like an old wives' tale of a macabre nature. It was that on chilly winter nights when the full cold moon was high in the jet black, starless sky, bathing the entire graveyard in a ghostly, milky glow, that the people who happened to be passing the wrought iron gates of the cemetery would say they had seen them there dance and play. 5 beautiful, yet otherworldly nymphs singing and dancing joyfully around the very oldest, largest evergreen yew. The tree had been there since the very first gravestone was laid, a sapling at the time. Nobody had ever been able to hear the song of the spirits, but all that spoke of their encounter said that it was more a feeling, a sensation resonating and vibrating from the ground in a continuous, steady, melodic, hypnotic hum that, each said, filled their bodies and seemed to put all who heard it in a trance. Some people believed the ethereal beings to be the children of Aed, prince of the underworld, coming above ground to round up any lost souls who may have fallen on the wayside to take back down to Dinyashi, as they were a superstition lot in those parts, but many other people thought the apparitions were those residents of the graveyard itself who just wanted to stretch their limbs by rising from the eternal slumber a while to recreate the fun times they once had when they were alive. Nothing of any horror was ever witnessed, or come to think of it, befell the onlookers of this uncanny performance, and in time, the happening became fondly thought of by the locals and somewhat taken into their hearts. In the end, nobody will ever know the real truth behind the enigma. As time has passed, the actual location of the mysterious graveyard has been lost in the tides of time. The mystery of the Soul Tree will always be that. Inspired by the tale that our gran used to tell us. The legend of the river Lima bears a striking resemblance to the river Lethe from Greek mythology, often referred to as the river of forgetfulness. However, in my country, this legend is deeply rooted in history, specifically the Roman invasion. When the Romans invaded, the Lusitanian people, having been nearly completely conquered, sought refuge in crossing this river. They believed that the Romans would not cross without following a specific ritual, which only they knew would cause them to forget everything about themselves. However, a general crossed the river, shouting out his name and the names of all his soldiers, causing the Lusitanians on the other side to react with shock. The legend of Walking Sam. Though he goes by other names too, most notably Tall Man or Stovepipe Hat Bigfoot, most of the stories describe Walking Sam as a 7-foot-tall figure with eyes but no mouth, sometimes wearing a stovepipe hat. Near the Black Hills of South Dakota sits one of the largest Indian reservations in the country, the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. Home to the Oglala Lakota tribe, Pine Ridge has a long history of trauma. It's where hundreds of Lakota Indians were killed during the Wounded Knee Massacre. When it made headlines in 2015 for a spree of teens ending themselves, many began to suggest that darker supernatural forces were at work in Pine Ridge, citing the urban legend of Walking Sam. Between December 2014 and March 2015, there were 103 attempts made. 9 of those were successful, and none of the victims were older than 25. Many died by hanging. In previous years there had been other clusters, but none this large. Stuck in a crisis situation with no clear answers, many began to point to a sinister force that has long existed in Native American tradition and lore. Children raised in Lakota households grow up hearing of those spirits, stick people, or shadow people who attempt to lure adolescents from the safety of their homes at night. When Sam raises his arms, one sees the bodies of previous victims hanging beneath. When teenagers hear him calling, he tries to persuade them of their worthlessness, encouraging them to kill themselves. Some believe he targets younger people because they are more susceptible to his tricks. There are also those who believe he is not even necessarily a malicious entity, but rather one who wanders the forests as punishment and is merely looking for companionship. Finally, for a people group who have such an intertwined spiritual connection between the land and their heritage, some believe that Walking Sam is a sort of physical manifestation of the hurt and trauma that Lakota Indians experience on a regular basis. The Woman in White. In Chicago, there is the legend of the Woman in White, a sad-looking young woman in a white dress seen walking along Archer Avenue. There are accounts of young men who pick her up and drive her to the entrance of the cemetery on Archer Avenue, where she disappears. My grandfather claimed to have been one of those men. This legend is connected with a horrible accident that really took place before the Depression. I don't know the names off the top of my head, but the Woman in White is supposed to be the ghost of a young Polish immigrant who was in her late teens when the events took place. She was drawn to dance clubs and liked to wear white dresses. She had a boyfriend whom she'd meet at her favorite club, and they'd dance the night away. One night she was late arriving at the club, and because he had nothing else to do, he asked another lady to dance to pass the time away. His girlfriend saw this, and dancing with another woman like that was probably like infidelity to her. She got upset and decided to walk home along Archer Avenue. After his dance, a friend told the boyfriend that his girl left mad at him. He hopped into his car and went down Archer as fast as he could to make up with her, but it was dark, and he was going too fast, so when he did find her, he lost control of his car and ran her over, right by the entrance of the cemetery. The Woman in White is supposed to be the ghost of that girl. She takes rides from young men who see her walking alone at night, and she always seems sad and quiet. When she gets out of the car, it's at the entrance to the cemetery. When she approaches the gate, she vanishes. My grandfather said he'd given her a ride. He was trying to be kind to a lady he saw alone at night. He said she was pretty but quiet and so sad, even he felt like crying. He didn't question letting her off at the cemetery until they arrived. He called to her as she walked up to the gate to offer her a ride someplace else, but she was gone. I sometimes think he told me that story because I was a little kid and it was just a chance to amuse me, but it was the only ghost story he ever told. It is likely that the Dullahan carries a whip made from a spine. The Dullahan, dark man, was a malevolent harbinger of death whose roots lie in Celtic mythology. He is said to be the embodiment of Crom Dubh, a fertility god who demanded blood sacrifice in the form of decapitation. His worship ended with the coming of Christianity to Ireland. Frustrated by the loss of his sacrifice, he still roams the roads, calling the names of those doomed to die and carrying his head under his arm. The flesh of the face is decayed, with a specific, and slightly odd, reference to the consistency of the flesh being akin to moldy cheese recurring in many tellings of the tale. Makes the headless horseman look like a clown. So my family grew up in Kentucky. I was raised by my dad's side of the family. My mama had a legend she has passed down to everyone, including the youngest generations. She always told us whenever we were going near the creek, the woods, basically anywhere there might be danger, that if we didn't watch out, blue eyes and bloody bones would get us. In our family, this is a being that is skeletal humanoid covered in blood and shining blue eyes. I've researched this, and it does seem my mama altered a different legend of old bloody bones, adding the piercing blue eyes details. Did any of you grow up with these types of legends that nobody outside your family or area uses or would have heard of? Has anyone heard of the legend of blue eyes and bloody bones? I lived the next town over from where the events of the legend of Sleepy Hollow took place, so that is probably the most well-known of the local legends near me. There are, even within Washington Irving's telling of that story, some subtales. One of which involves a big rock, 80 to 90 feet tall, out in the woods called Raven's Rock. Apparently there are 3 spirits that haunt it. If I recall correctly, one is a Native American girl who threw herself off of it after being spurned by a lover. The second is a Revolutionary War girl who fell off the rock and died while she was trying to get away from a rapacious British soldier. And the third is a woman in white who got lost in a snowstorm one night and sought refuge at the base of the rock and was found dead the next morning. She apparently becomes active before snowstorms and will shriek as the storm is approaching. It's one of my favorite hikes in the area, and I've been a number of times, and each time I go, as you get closer to it, the air becomes thicker and more hushed. I've been there, albeit under the influence of marijuana, where it seemed like time has slowed way down. I distinctly remember in the fall watching yellow sunlit leaves fall off a beech tree, where it seemed like they took forever to fall to the ground. I can still replay that image in my mind. I've also been there before a snowstorm when there was a white bird of prey, not sure what kind, maybe the woman in white, that was flying among the trees and screeching as it did. There are also a lot of three-trunked trees around there that I've noticed, and once, when I was there most recently, I put my hand in a pile of poison ivy while I was climbing up the rock, and on my way out, I was hoping that I'd find some jewelweed, which is an antidote, even though this was not a place where I thought jewelweed would grow and it was early in the season for it, and lo and behold, I found a small patch by the side of the trail. Not sure if it's a myth or just this one old-timer story, but we'll share it here. My dad's cousins lived in Bisbee in the 1960s and worked as a bartender in one of the saloons there. She said there was an old man, probably in his 90s, who would come in and drink whiskey like once a month. He lived alone off the grid, in his family's homestead up in the foothills of the Chiricahua Mountains, and would come into Bisbee periodically. As she got to know him, she learned that his family had been in the area since the early 1800s, when southern Arizona was still part of Mexico, and had a ranch in the eastern foothills of the Chiricahua Mountains, where he was born in the late 1800s and grew up. After they had been friends for a while, he decided that one evening he was going to tell her a story about one of those times they hunted up in the Chiricahuas when he was about 16 or 17. He told her he and his father and brother were up in the Chiricahuas in some remote area and had killed a buck, and it was close to sunset, so they found an area in a side canyon to camp for the night. They had gutted and hung the deer from a gnarled juniper, tied the horses, and went to sleep near a fire. He said near sunrise, the horses began to freak out, and this woke them all up. The fire had died, and in the dim light before the sun had risen, they could make out something large tearing at the carcass of the deer they had hung. They all jumped up and grabbed their rifles, assuming it was a black bear or mountain lion. The horses had broken loose and were nowhere to be seen. He said his dad let off a shot at the shape, which got its attention, and instead of running away, it turned on them. He said as it ran towards them, barely visible in the pre-dawn light, he realized it wasn't a bear but looked more like an enormous reptile. Large on two legs, running fast right at them. They didn't have a chance to get another shot off before it was on them. He said it used a large clawed arm and swiped it across his chest as he scrambled away, barely escaping its open jaws. He said it was almost on him again when another gunshot rang out, hitting the thing in the back, where it let out a terrifying scream, and it ran and jumped up the fallen rocks and boulders, further up the canyon. He noticed it had a long tail as it bolted away. The man had 3 giant gashes across his chest that were bleeding. They were pretty deep, with some of the bone showing. They patched the man the best they could and hurried to find the horses and get the hell out there. They left the deer carcass hanging there and made their way out of the mountains, but he said it was the most terrifying experience he ever had. Of course my dad's cousin thought the man was bullshitting her. She was like, "Oh ha ha, nice scary story." She said he didn't laugh but instead unbuttoned his shirt and showed him the scars that ran across his chest, 3 of them, like an ancient claw mark. She was convinced that the old-timer was telling the truth after that, and she got to trying to figure out what kind of creature it was. As unbelievable as it was, she said the only thing she could think of was a dinosaur, so she found a children's book with artist renditions of dinosaurs and brought it to the bar so she could show it to him the next time he came in. The next time he made his way down to Bisbee, she showed him the book, and she said as he flipped through it, he stopped at one page and pointed to the dinosaur rendition on the page. It was the velociraptor, and he told her the creature looked similar but not exactly the same. She was convinced after that he must have encountered some type of dinosaur. The Lampon Worm. It's a local legend in my city. The short version is that Lord Lambton skipped church to go fishing and pulled out a snake-like fish, possibly a lamprey. A witch appears and tells him that the fish is the devil, so he throws it in a well. Years later, Lord Lambton goes on a crusade and, upon returning, finds that the worm has grown into a giant serpentine dragon and is torturing the residents of Sunderland, and everyone who has tried to slay it has failed because whenever a piece of the dragon is cut off, the beast reattaches it. Upon deciding to slay the dragon, the witch reappears and tells him to wear spike armor to prevent the worm from grabbing him. She also tells him that once the beast is slain, he must kill the first living thing that he sees, otherwise, his descendants would be cursed for 9 generations and wouldn't die in their beds. The plan is for his father to sound the hunting horn upon Lord Lambton's return so that the hunting dog would run towards him to be slain. However, in all the excitement of the dragon being finally defeated, Lord Lambton's father forgot to sound the horn and ran towards his son. Lord Lambton couldn't bring himself to slay his own father, so the family was cursed. It is thought that the story gained so much popularity because for the next 3 generations all of the Lord Lambton's descendants actually did die early, the first 2 in battle, one fighting in Wakefield and one somewhere else. The third one died in his carriage crossing a bridge. 4 years ago the Lambton family estate was open to the public. The gardens are gorgeous and are about 700 years old. Chiricahua Crystal Cave. The cave goes further than listed but may be restricted access to go further in. My uncle went in a few times in the 60s/70s before gates were closed and said there were remains of camps from divers that never came out, a river, and more in the cave way back. Coronado National Forest, Chiricahua Crystal Cave, USDA.gov. The Old Black Church/Western Graveyard, Wilcox, Oz. On the south side of Wilcox, a burned-out two-story Old West-type church was standing that was a local haunting spot known to have covens and seances hold rites and rituals there a lot. There is much activity for supernaturals there. A nearby Old West graveyard is hidden on the back 40 and used for similar. Hidden on the east side of the train tracks on the south end of town. Northwestern edge of the Grand Canyon, heading south from the north edge, City of the Giants inside the canyon walls. A large city reported to have burial/sarcophagi for giants, large humans 12 to 15 tall, and other unusual items found. Was found back in 1916-17. Closed off access by the US government after the Smithsonian got involved. If you wander too close, you are run off by people showing up from hidden watch spots. I tried rafting with friends in the 90s down that way, no issues till we pulled ashore and went exploring and looking for caves. I got stopped by a very well-armed park ranger and told to go back and keep on rafting. Wetu from North American folklore. The Wetu is a man-eating creature or evil spirit appearing in the legends of the Athabascan people. In Beaver, Danza, mythology, it is said to be a person who has been possessed or overwhelmed by the power of one of the ancient giant spirit animals. These giant animals were crafty, intelligent, powerful, and somehow retained their power despite being transformed into the normal-sized animals of the present day. The Danza believed that one could become Wetu by breaking a taboo and becoming too strong. Examples of these taboos include a person having a photo taken with a flash, listening to music made with a stretched string or hide, such as guitar music, or eating meat with fly eggs in it. Like the wendigo, the Wetu seeks to eat people, attempting to lure them away from their fellows by cunning. In one folktale, it is made of ice and very strong, and is only killed by being thrown on a campfire and kept there overnight until it is melted. Being a Wetu is considered a curse and a punishment, as they are destructive and cannibalistic creatures. The descriptions of Wetu vary a lot. Belief in Wetu is prevalent among the Athabascan and some other peoples of the Pacific Northwest. They are described as malevolent, cannibalistic, and supernatural beings. They share many similarities to the Wendigo and the Htoot, the main difference being that Wetu are more powerful since they are born from the cursed souls of humans who have engaged in severe cultural taboos. They are also considered very intelligent and cunning creatures who plan out their hunt and may even engage in trapping and similar. The Gray Man. In South Carolina ghost lore, the Gray Man is a ghost reportedly seen on the coast of Pawleys Island, South Carolina, that warns residents of coming severe storms and hurricanes. Although there are many variations of the legend, most say the Gray Man was first seen in 1822, 3 years before the town government was incorporated. The last reported sighting was just before Hurricane Florence hit in 2018 and previously just before Hurricane Hugo hit the area in 1989. Legend holds that the Gray Man is the ghost of a young man traveling from Charleston to see his fiancée in 1822. On the way, he and his horse were caught in quicksand like pluff mud in the marshes before Pawleys Island and died. His spirit has haunted the shore nearby ever since, looking for the girl he loved. The legend appears to have first entered print in Julian Stevenson Bollock's book Waccamaw Plantations, published in 1946, and was repeated more elaborately in his 1956 book of ghost stories. The Gray Man got national attention just after Hurricane Hugo when residents Jim and Clara Moore were interviewed on the television show Unsolved Mysteries, which aired in 1990. They told their story about seeing the man on the beach and how he disappeared when they waved. Their house was spared in the storm while the homes of their neighbors were heavily damaged. The Weather Channel aired a series in 2014, American Super/Natural, that devoted an entire episode to the Gray Man. People who have allegedly encountered the spirit have credited him with saving them or their homes. Either they have come ashore or left the area and returned to find their homes and belongings unscathed by severe storms. He has been described as a man wearing gray clothing, a long coat, dressed like a pirate, and sometimes without legs. I come from Southeast Asia, and the folklore you hear here is very different from the ones you hear in the UK and US. First and foremost, our most famous ghost is a Pontiano. It can be compared to our version of the Lady in White. She is basically a female ghost who died in childbirth. She appears in the night with the sweet smell of frangipani flowers and comes as the most beautiful woman you've ever seen, fair skin, very long hair, white gown. As she nears, the smell of flowers becomes rotten meat, and the beautiful lady becomes a vicious vampiric ghoul who will then rip out your organs with her long, sharp nails and start devouring them. She also targets unfaithful men for revenge and rips and eats them. They are believed to live in banana trees, and if you have a nail from a coffin and some red string, you can try to catch one to do your bidding or destroy. But do it wrong or release her, and she will come to kill you. The Pontiano is popular in places like Malaysia and Indonesia. In fact, the town of Pontiano in Indonesia is supposedly named after the ghost that resided there. Other names include Kuntilanak in Indonesia, Chanak in the Philippines, and Langsur in Malaysia and Indonesia, though some say it is a different but similar ghost than the Pontiano. A second ghost is the Htoot. Kum Kum. She is an old lady ghost, also known as a witch, who roams the streets in search of virgins, feeding on their blood to maintain her youthful appearance. Htoot means ghost, and Kum Kum, as in comb without the B sound, is the sound she makes as she wanders. Kum comes from the Malay greeting Salamu alaikum, which means peace be upon you, a phrase Muslims often greet each other with. But since it's a holy blessing, the ghost/witch is not allowed to say it since it's unholy, and hence she can only say the last syllable, Kum. Finally, to reward you for staying with me for so long, here's a fun ghost from the region. It's called Htoot Tek. Once again, Htoot refers to a ghost, while Tek translates to breasts. The ghost is an old lady or witch with super long breasts that she would attract children to suckle, and when children approached her, she would then strangle them with her breasts or hide them under her large, floppy, drooping breasts. The parents may go out and search for the child, but under the ghostly boobs they cannot see the child nor the ghost. The child is able to see her parent though, but is unable to make a sound. The Htoot Tek is found in Malaysian and Indonesian folklore. I don't know if it's real, but this is popular, no prize for guessing why, and is probably at least a fable to scare children so they would not go out and wander at nightfall. Here's Chinese folklore for you. We also have something called the Jian Gui, or in local dialect, the Jabak Gui. This ghost is said to cover your eyes to blind your vision. You can still see, but you will lose your way and end up walking in circles. You will find it hard to escape the loop dimension that you're caught in, until you meet with harm and lose your life. Your soul will then take the place of the ghost, as the ghost is now able to go into reincarnation for the next life. Basically, you become the substitute for the ghost. Jian Gui is directly translated as cover eye ghost. Samodiva from Bulgarian folklore. The Samodiva or Vila are woodland fairies or nymphs found in South and West Slavic folklore. In Romania, they are known as Lele. Samodivas are commonly depicted as ethereal maidens with long, loose hair and, in some cases, wings. They are typically dressed in free-flowing, feathered white gowns, which give them the power of flight. Samodivas are often described as blonde, tall, slender women with pale, glowing skin and fiery eyes. According to folklore, Samodivas can live inside trees, abandoned shacks, dark caves, or near rivers, ponds, and wells. Mountains linked to the Samodivas include Vitasha, Belasica, Pirin, Rila, Rodopi, the Balkan Mountains in Bulgaria, and the Rudina Mountains. However, Mountain Pirin is their traditional favorite. Samodivas enter the human world during the spring, staying until autumn. During the winter, they live in the mythical village of Zmikovo. Samodivas are believed to be very beautiful women with an affinity for fire. They have the power to bring about drought, burn a farmer's crops, or make cattle die of high fever. It is said that, when angered, a Samodiva can change her appearance and turn into a monstrous bird, capable of throwing fire at her enemies. They also have the power of their seductive voices. They are usually hostile and dangerous to people. Men who gaze upon a Samodiva fall instantly in love, or lust, and women take their own lives at the sight of such beauty. Another important aspect of the myths surrounding Samodivas is their dance. Beginning at midnight and finishing at dawn, their dance symbolized the raw energy of both nature and the supernatural world. Accompanied and following only the rhythm of the wind and their own singing, their dance was said to have been often witnessed by lost or late travelers, some of them choosing to join it, seduced by the beauty of their song and visage, only to die of exhaustion at dawn, when the Samodivas finally disappeared. Samodiva's power is believed to come mostly from her long hair. A Samodiva would sometimes give a small portion of it to her lover to strengthen her control over him via its magical effects. If her hair is damaged in some way, she will lose her power and vanish. Growing up in Cookeville, Tennessee, we had Crazy George's Bridge and Booger Swamp. Crazy George's Bridge goes over a railroad track where a railroad worker was supposedly decapitated by a train. He wanders the tracks with a lantern looking for his head, and if you stop your car on the bridge at night, it won't start back up again. I'm in the 80s, It was also rumored that Satanists used the bridge for rituals, and for decades, teenagers have tested the theories with late-night visits. Booger Swamp was a wooded area where a witch supposedly lived, and if your animals went missing, it was said she had called them to her lair to use for spells and potions. There's also a witch's cemetery with strange pyramid-shaped tombs. El Chupacabra from American urban legends. El Chupacabra, or Chupacabras, goat sucker, is a legendary creature in the folklore of parts of the Americas, with its first purported sightings reported in Puerto Rico in 1995. The name comes from the animal's reported vampirism. The Chupacabra is said to attack and drink the blood of livestock, including goats. Physical descriptions of the creature vary, with some describing it as more dog-like while others describe it as more lizard or even alien-like. Some report it as being a heavy creature the size of a small bear, with a row of spines reaching from the neck to the base of the tail. Eyewitness sightings have been claimed in Puerto Rico and have since been reported as far north as Maine, as far south as Chile, and even outside the Americas in countries like Russia and the Philippines. The first reported attack eventually attributed to the actual chupacabras occurred in March 1995. 8 sheep were discovered dead in Puerto Rico, each with 3 puncture wounds in the chest area and reportedly completely drained of blood. A few months later, in August, an eyewitness named Madeline Tolentino reported seeing the creature in the Puerto Rican town of Canavanas, where as many as 150 farm animals and pets were reportedly killed. In October and December 2018, there were many reports of suspected chupacabras in Manipur, India. Many domestic animals and poultry were killed in a suspicious manner similar to other chupacabra attacks, and several people reported that they had seen chupacabras. The most common description of the chupacabra is that of a reptile-like creature, said to have leathery or scaly greenish-gray skin and sharp spines or quills running down its back. It is said to be approximately 3 to 4 feet, 0.9 to 1.2 meters, high and stands and hops in a fashion similar to that of a kangaroo. Another common description of the chupacabra is a strange breed of wild dog. This form is mostly hairless and has a pronounced spinal ridge, unusually pronounced eye sockets, fangs, and claws. Unlike conventional predators, the chupacabra is said to drain all of the animal's blood, and sometimes organs, usually through 3 holes in the shape of a downwards pointing triangle, but sometimes through only 1 or 2 holes. Baku from Japanese mythology. Baku are Japanese supernatural beings that are said to devour nightmares. According to legend, they were created by the spare pieces that were left over when the gods finished creating all other animals. The Baku is a strange holy beast that has the body of a bear, the head of an elephant, the eyes of a rhinoceros, the tail of an ox, and the legs of a tiger. Despite their monstrous appearance, Baku are revered as powerful forces of good and as one of the holy protectors of mankind. Baku watch over humans and act as guardian spirits. They feed on the dreams of humans, specifically bad dreams. Evil spirits and yokai fear Baku and flee from them, avoiding areas inhabited by them. Therefore, health and good luck follow a Baku wherever it goes. The Baku's written name and image have been used as symbols of good luck in talismans and charms throughout Japanese history. Legend has it that a person who wakes up from a bad dream can call out to Baku. A child having a nightmare in Japan will wake up and repeat 3 times, "Baku-san, come eat my dream." Legends say that the Baku will come into the child's room and devour the bad dream, allowing the child to go back to sleep peacefully. However, calling to the Baku must be done sparingly, because if he remains hungry after eating one's nightmare, he may also devour their hopes and desires as well, leaving them to live an empty life. The Baku can also be summoned for protection from bad dreams prior to falling asleep at night. A story told to me by a guy I find credible and reputable, but he may not want his name associated with this. He was a young man, about 17. Lived out in West Phoenix. Suburbs now, but in the 70s, all cattle farms. He and 2 girls were headed out into the cattle farm/desert to do a little drinking, but his pickup gas gauge was busted. They get halfway out there, and the truck dies. He goes to the back to get the spare gas can, and as he fills the tank, a bunch of cows come stampeding by, at like midnight when cows are usually docile. He looks up, and this tall gray creature on 2 legs, it looks like a man on stilts, but with a hunched back and maybe 8 or 9 feet tall, comes lumbering after the cattle. Stops on the road and looks at him. Then he takes off after the cattle again. He's thinking that it was his mind playing tricks on him, but then he looks up at the girl that was riding in the back of the truck, and she's petrified with a look of horror on her face, weeping and gasping for air. They decide to bail on the night and muy pronto. A few days later, she finally agrees to talk about it, and they compare notes. They saw the same thing. Alien? Skinwalker? Vampire? Is this a circus freak, dressed up and chasing cattle? He has no clue what it was, but he won't go out in cow pastures anymore. Not a local legend, but more of a local myth. In Krackow, Poland, there's a statue of a dragon that shoots out fire. As the story goes, there was a dragon that was notorious for eating virgins, which essentially pissed everybody off in the town. Enough was enough, so the king decided to offer his daughter up for marriage as an award to anyone who could slay the dragon. This prompted many men to try and kill the beast, yet to no success. When all hope was thought to be lost, a shoemaker decided to create a sheep decoy that was filled with sulfur and placed it in front of the dragon's cave. The next morning, the dragon wakes up, sees the sheep decoy, and eats it whole. As a result, the dragon's throat began to burn, and the mighty beast rushed to the Wetu river and began to drink. However, sulfur and water are highly reactive when combined, thus, the dragon exploded and died. The king, true to his word, offered his daughter to the shoemaker, who found himself unworthy of her hand and politely declined. Instead, the shoemaker requested the dragon skin of the slain monster to make shoes. Legend has it that, if you search hard enough in Krackow, you can find shoes made of dragon skin today. Datsu-ba from Japanese folklore. Datsu-ba is an old woman who sits at the edge of the Sanzu River in the Buddhist underworld. At the river, she has two primary duties. According to Japanese Buddhist folklore, when a child dies, its soul has to cross the Sanzu River. Traditionally, when a person dies, it is believed that they can cross the river at 3 different spots depending on how they live their lives. Since children have not accumulated enough experiences, however, they are unable to cross. At the river's edge, the souls of deceased children are met by Datsu-ba. There, she strips the children of their clothes and advises them to build a pile of pebbles on which they can climb to reach paradise. But before the pile reaches any significant height, the hag and underworld demons maliciously knock it down. The Buddhist Bodhisattva Jizo saves these souls from having to pile stones forever on the bank of the river by hiding them in his robe. When a soul is that of an adult, Datsu-ba forces the sinners to take off their clothes, and the old man Kenyo hangs these clothes on a riverside branch that bends to reflect the gravity of the sins. If the sinner arrives with no clothing, Datsu-ba strips them of their skin. Various levels of punishment are performed even at this early stage. For those who steal, for example, Datsu-ba breaks their fingers, and together with her old man consort, she ties the head of the sinner to the sinner's feet. The Jersey Devil. For those of you unfamiliar, it is a horse-hoofed, goat-faced, devil child born over 100 years ago that roams rural New Jersey hunting and feasting on those it captures. Now, did I ever meet the Jersey Devil? No. However, are there strange occurrences that some locals like to chalk up to his presence? Absolutely. Just a few years ago, at a local campground, there were a string of thefts over the span of one summer. Campers would wake up in the morning to find either a pot or pan missing, clothes, bottles of water, or blankets. Never was more than one item stolen at a time, but when a running list of stolen items was put together, it became obvious that whoever had stolen all the items had what amounted to a full set of equipment to camp out for the long haul. Local police chalked it up to some low-level criminal who wanted to stow away in the Pine Barrens and not be found. Come the end of summer, and the theft stopped. Throughout the fall and winter, no more thefts occurred as well. Fall and winter camping is quite popular in South Jersey. But come early spring, a few hikers came across a makeshift campsite deep in the Pygmy Pines. The winter took a toll on it, but it was clear that it had been used within the past year. A few yards away from the site, they found a body. The person was fully clothed with no obvious signs of trauma. The state police were called in and could find no signs of foul play. However, the coroner discovered that the body was so well preserved not because it was frozen for the winter but because it had been exsanguinated. I live near Statesville, a city in North Carolina. It's a small town, but it's widely spread out with lots of woods and farmland. There's a lot of history here, as well as a lot of old buildings. The first story is one you may have heard about. If you've ever heard the folk song Tom Dooley or seen the movie The Legend of Tom Dooley, then you may know of this one. The real Tom Dooley was a former Confederate soldier who was convicted of ending a girl he was sweet on named Laura Foster. He was convicted, tried, and executed in Statesville, and the spot in the road where the gallows that hanged him are still there. To his last moments, Dooley swore he never hurt a hair on her head. There have been sparse reports of people seeing a man in a Confederate soldier's outfit wandering the alleys in the downtown area, but I haven't seen anything myself. The historic Vance Hotel. Built in 1922, the hotel was the place to stay if you came through town. This was back when Statesville was a major hub of commerce and was well traveled. My great-grandparents took their honeymoon there, as the Vance Hotel was a luxury establishment for the area. There was even a pool in the basement. There are a couple stories about deaths in the hotel and a little girl drowning in the pool, but I can't confirm any of these. The hotel is closed today but still stands. It sometimes has people enter it for ghost walks, which I've been inside for, but I never saw anything. Guess that's just my luck, because I've been around quite a few haunted areas and have never seen anything. The Boston train bridge is arguably the most chilling story I can think of. This bridge has been around for many decades and still carries trains across it today. In 1892, however, a disaster occurred. A train headed towards Statesville derailed off the bridge and careened into the ravine below. The passenger cars quickly filled with water, and as many as 23 people perished in the catastrophe. 50 years later, a woman and her husband were making their way to Statesville by road when their car broke down near the bridge. Her husband left to walk towards the nearest gas station for help, leaving the woman alone. After some time, the woman heard a train coming. She looked on in horror as the train derailed and crashed into the ravine. She ran towards the wreckage and found a man who looked to be a railroad employee with his pocket watch out and asking for the time. She ignored the man and ran back to the road as her husband and a mechanic had just arrived. She pleaded with them to come help with the wreck that had just occurred, but the train and the man were gone. This sparked an annual Phantom Train Watch. Paranormal enthusiasts gather every year in hopes of seeing the train repeat itself once more. No one's seen anything yet, but going near the bridge is heavily discouraged. A man was actually killed one year when he was struck by an actual train. The bridge is still active, so if you do decide to check it out, don't walk out on it. Ciguapa from Dominican folklore. A ciguapa is a mythological creature of Dominican folklore. They are commonly described as having human female form with brown or dark blue skin, backward-facing feet, and very long manes of smooth, glossy hair that cover their bodies. They supposedly inhabit the high mountains of the Dominican Republic. These creatures have nocturnal habits. Also, due to the position of their feet, one can never quite tell which direction the beings are moving by looking at their footprints. Some people believe that they bring death, and it is said that one should not look them in the eye, otherwise, the person is at risk of being bewitched permanently. The only vocalization made by ciguapas is said to be a kind of whine or chirping. Ciguapas are considered to be magical beings, beautiful in appearance to some yet horrendous to others. All sources agree that they are wild creatures. They are compared in many cases to mermaids, beautiful yet cruel and far from innocent. Deceitful and ready to capture the wayward traveler, it is said that they are so beautiful that they can lure men into the forest to make love with them, only to kill them afterward. Legends have suggested that some are benevolent and wish not to kill trespassers, though not much evidence supports this claim. Even today, one can still find inhabitants who confirm having sighted a ciguapa. Lore states that the only way to capture a ciguapa is by tracking them at night, during a full moon, with a black and white polydactylic dog, called a cincano dog. Concerning elves. My mother, God rest her soul, once told me a story. It concerned a patch of public ground near the house I grew up in. It had a long history for those who cared to look into it. Victorian limestone mines, a Civil War battleground, the seat of a Norman lord, the tutelus of a Bronze Age chieftain. These facts were known, and many more had been imagined by the children who played in the area. But only in daylight. Don't go there in the dark, we were told. It's a terrible place, in fact, don't go there at all. But as children, we spent all the time we could there. Looking back with older eyes, it seems folk throughout history had been drawn to this area, just a 5-square-mile patch of marshland, pools, and fields sandwiched between a canal, a railway line, and a modern housing estate. And so too were we. An adventurous paradise. We'd make rope swings by the lake, go hunting for tadpoles, build dens in the woods, and try not to lose our wellies in the sucking mud in the patch of marshland. I remember my mother and I walking our mongrel dog, Bonnie, there. She told me what she knew of the area, and once, at twilight after a long walk, we saw the marsh lights, the eerie flickering shapes. My mother knew otherwise. These flickering lights weren't just natural swamp gas, but elves, she said, the fey folk, the shining ones, the fair folk. The ones who live at the boundaries of our rational and sensible world. The ones who exist only in our peripheral vision and only bestow their charms and gifts on those they desire. My mother was an exceptional artist. Our house was dotted with her paintings, furniture she had reupholstered and antiques she had restored. She even owed a local hairdresser. She was always good with her hands. But there's always a price, she said. The clues were always there. It was even in the modern translation of our town, Waleshoe, the place of the ones who were here first. They let us live there, but we only thrived for as long as they allowed it, it seems. The limestone mines were worked out within 50 years, the Norman lord had endless struggles with other feudal landowners, and the Cavaliers fought Cromwell's Roundhead troops to such a bloody standstill that the mud was stained with blood for months after, it was said. But while the elves were generous, the people prospered, and on the whole it was reckoned it was worth it, even though I have modern memories of the occasional child going missing there and a near drowning in the lake. My mother put milk outside the door once a week. She said it was for the hedgehogs, but she still made sure that the nail holding the horseshoe above the back door was good and secure. Elves hate iron. You want them close, but you don't want them inside, and in my 19th year, she sickened and died. I know it was cancer. The doctor said it was. But in my heart, I know different. Eventually, the elves come to collect. Those who are different. Those who are considered touched. We have our gifts, and they are great, but we always pay the price. We have to. I now live far away from that elf-haunted place in my old hometown. I don't put milk out anymore, nor keep a horseshoe above the door. There are different spirits in this land, and I do not believe they would allow the elves to be welcomed here. But I still believe one day they will come for me. The Lampon Worm, Durham. A young nobleman named John Lampton decided one Sunday that instead of going to church, he would go fishing in the river Ware. As he collected his things and made his way, an old man warned him that no good can come from missing church. For a while he caught nothing, so he cursed at the river and then almost immediately caught a strange black worm. He threw it in a nearby well, disgusted. John then grows up and forgets about the worm. He ends up joining the Crusades, feeling guilty about his past. But all the while the Lampton worm was growing bigger and bigger down the well, poisoning the water. It begins to eat livestock and grows bigger still. Eventually it works its way out of the well and wraps itself around Penshaw Hill, terrorizing villages. Greedy, it slithers to Lampton Castle, and here it encounters John Lampton's elderly father, who offers it the milk of 9 cows to appease it. It accepts and is pacified for a while. No matter who tries to harm the worm, it doesn't take chunks cut off grow back, it kills any challenger, and it can uproot and hurl trees in anger. John Lampton returns, and seeing the devastation, decides to kill the worm, but first talks to a local witch. She tells him to wear spiked armor and to fight in the river Ware, the same spot he caught it. And also that once he kills the worm, he must then immediately kill the first living creature he sees, or his family will be cursed to never die in their beds. He marched to the river and fought fiercely, but the worm resisted. It wrapped itself around John, but with his sharp armor, the worm was cut to ribbons. The pieces fell into the river, and the flow was too fast for the worm to heal, so thus the worm was dead. John sounds his horn 3 times, a sign for his father to release his favor hound so that he can slay it to show devotion and repentance to God as per the witch's instructions. His father, however, was so happy the beast was dead he instead ran to congratulate his son, making him the first living creature he saw. Unable to kill his father, he opts to kill the dog anyway and hopes the curse was kept at bay. But it didn't work, and the Lamptons were cursed to never die peacefully in their beds. The Coal Mountain Lights. This story comes from a small town called Moorfield in West Virginia. It's one of my favorite stories from this region. There are not many ghost stories in this small town. I know some parts of the story that not many others know. When I was around 1 to 2 years old, we lived on a road right next to the mountain. One night, the mountain began to emit this phantom glow. It continued to spread around the mountain as our neighbors gathered outside in awe of the strange phenomenon. My dad thought a fire had started on the mountain and called 911 to report the potential fire. Others also called for similar reports that night, but the firemen searched every road on the mountain in hopes of finding any type of fire or even where the odd glows were coming from, but they found nothing. Slowly the glow, after burning brightly for a few hours, faded out, and we have not heard of any more ghostly reports since. Yet, years later, one of my teachers came to school one day and taught us about the legends of the Coal Mountain. She also included a story from her mother and father's first date. This happened before 2008, not sure on the exact date. They had gone to Coal Mountain, and the teacher's father was trying to impress the teacher's mother by going on the mountain and chilling with her in the car for a bit. Then this orb of light was floating to the car. The teacher's father was convinced it was one of his friends messing with him. The teacher's mother was freaking out, trying to convince him to drive away. The teacher's father laughed at how scared she was and got out of the car. The orb was maybe about 20 feet from the car, and the orb comes closer to him. At this point, he notices the light is not a flashlight or any sort of prank when it is standing there with no source. Needless to say, they bolted away in their car. The Legend of Mamie Thurman. Living in this part of West Virginia, you can't grow up without hearing the famous story of Mamie Thurman. There are several versions of this story, but this is the one I grew up hearing. Mamie Thurman was a beautiful woman back in 1932. Her husband Jack was a patrolman from Kentucky, and one day he got a job offer from Logan County, West Virginia. Jack jumped at the opportunity. So, he and Mamie packed up everything they had and moved to Logan in the hopes of laying down roots to start their family together. Jack being a patrolman back in those days, both he and Mamie got to meet some powerful people, including the mayor of Logan County. Now it is told that the mayor took a liking to Mamie, and before long a secret affair was started between the two. Mamie was the happiest she had been in years, but her marriage to Jack was starting to crumble. They would fight all the time, but Mamie didn't care. The mayor had filled her head and heart with talk of running away together. On June 21, 1932, Jack and Mamie were in the biggest fight they had ever had. Mamie couldn't take it anymore, so she tells Jack about her secret affair with the mayor. She also tells him that she is carrying the mayor's child and wants a divorce so she can have a chance at true happiness. Jack crumbles to the floor and starts crying like a 3-year-old, his heart was broken. Mamie walks to the closet, grabs her purse, and walks out the door, leaving Jack on the floor sobbing. Mamie goes straight to the mayor's office and tells him that she had finally done it, she had finally told Jack the truth about the two of them. She's smiling as she delivers the news of carrying his child. She feels delighted and free now, but when she looks at the mayor, she sees that all the color has drained from his face. The mayor was shocked at what Mamie had just told him. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then a thought ran across his mind. His wife was the one with all the money, without it, he would become just a poor country boy again. There was no way he was going back to that life, not for Mamie and certainly not for the child she supposedly claimed was his. The mayor came toward Mamie without any warning and slapped her across the face hard. She started crying, and he started screaming at her, telling her she was a damn fool for ever believing he would give up his life or his wife's money for her or a child that she so claimed to be his when it could very well belong to Jack. He then told her he just used her and lied to her to get what he wanted from her. That he never intended to run away with her. He called her stupid and Mamie, being completely broken, walked to the door, but before she left, she turned and looked at the mayor through tear-stained eyes and told him he would pay for what he had done to her. She didn't let him speak before she was out the door, slamming it shut behind her. A couple of hours later that day, a young boy was walking home on 22 Mine Road and discovered a body beside the road. He was so shocked at first he didn't know what to do except to run for help. The authorities were called, and the first patrolman there rushed to the body. It was a woman he had seen before. It was Mamie. Mamie's throat had been slashed from ear to ear, after which she was shot 2 times on the left side of her head. Found with her body were her shoes, all her jewelry, and her purse with money inside. The authorities ruled out robbery as a motive for killing Mamie. Some time later that same year, her murder was blamed on a poor handyman. The authorities said they had found enough evidence inside the handyman's home to arrest him. He was convicted of Mamie Thurman's murder, all the while screaming his innocence to everyone. Mamie's murder did raise more questions than answers in the community, and it's believed that the handyman never murdered Mamie. He was framed and used as a cover-up for the true killer. Mamie's body was sent back to her hometown in Kentucky, and to this day no one knows for sure where exactly she's buried. Mamie Thurman's murder has grown famous as the years have passed and technically still is one of Logan County's oldest unsolved mysteries to date. It is said that because Mamie's real killer was never caught, she is not at rest and haunts 22 Mine Road to this day. Some people have stories of seeing a woman walking the road at night and stopping to give her a ride, but the woman disappears. Others say that if you stop your car beside the road where she was found and put your car in neutral, she will push the car uphill to make her presence known. I just wonder if she is there, if she will ever tell someone what really happened that day so many years ago. Louisiana's chilling ghost stories and urban legends. With a unique history that includes pirates, voodoo queens, and even vampires, these stories are not for the faint of heart. What sets Louisiana apart is that many of these tales are based on true events, where mysteries remain unsolved and the unexplained is a regular occurrence. Cajun and Creole folklore are plentiful, with the French Quarter alone having more ghost and vampire sightings than the novel Interview with a Vampire. From werewolves to haunted houses, Louisiana's tales are sure to give you goosebumps. 1. Marie Laveau. Voodoo is synonymous with New Orleans, and at the heart of it all is the legendary figure of voodoo queen Marie Laveau. As a woman of mixed race, Laveau's power and influence extended beyond social and racial boundaries. Working as a hairdresser, she gained access to the secrets of the city's residents, regardless of their social status. She was also an innovator, blending Catholicism and voodoo to create the religion as it's known today. Though Laveau passed away in 1881, her daughter of the same name continued practicing her magic for many years. According to legend, Laveau's spirit returns to lead the faithful in worship on St. John's Eve each year. Her ghost, along with her daughters, have been sighted throughout the city, continuing to inspire awe and wonder to this day. 2. Vampire Brothers. During the 1930s, two seemingly ordinary brothers resided on a street in New Orleans' French Quarter, working as laborers and keeping a low profile. However, when a woman managed to escape from their apartment with self-inflicted wrist injuries, the police discovered several others in the same condition and over a dozen bodies drained of blood. It took multiple officers to apprehend the Carter brothers, who were subsequently executed and placed in their family's funeral vault. However, when the vault was opened years later, their bodies were nowhere to be found, and it's rumored that they still haunt the streets of New Orleans to this day. 3. Mysterious Coffins. During the early days of New Orleans colonization, the French struggled to convince women to settle there due to the harsh climate and the large number of criminals among the male population. One boat of women who had agreed to move to the city ended up abandoning ship in Mobile, Alabama, leaving behind 300 peculiar coffins. Some were reportedly empty, while others were said to hold the bodies of the undead. To prevent the coffins from opening on their own, they were all nailed shut and hidden away in the attic of a convent. Decades later in 1978, two reporters broke into the convent to see the coffins, but they were found decapitated on the convent steps the next morning with most of their blood drained. Their equipment had been destroyed, but the bizarre crime was never fully explained. 4. The Myrtle Plantation. During the 1800s, the Myrtles Plantation was owned by Judge Clark Woodruff, who assaulted his enslaved women, including Chloe, the children's governess. Fearful of being sent to work in the fields if she protested, Chloe decided to regain the judge's favor by poisoning his family with a small amount of oleander. However, her plan backfired, resulting in the death of the entire family. In order to avoid punishment from Woodruff, the other enslaved people lynched Chloe and disposed of her body in the river. Today, her spirit, along with the spirits of the Woodruff children, are said to haunt the Myrtles Plantation. 5. Vampire Comte Saint-Germain. The Comte Saint-Germain was a reputed alchemist who claimed to have discovered the elixir of eternal life and was highly revered by the French aristocracy in the court of Louis XV. He was believed to be over 6,000 years old and was said to have lived throughout Europe after his supposed death in Germany. In 1903, a man who claimed to be Jacques Saint-Germain, a relative of the Comte, arrived in New Orleans and took up residence at a house on the corner of Royal and Ursuline Streets. Known as a charming ladies' man, Saint-Germain's reputation took a dark turn after a woman he had been seeing claimed he had attacked and bitten her before jumping out of his window. When police searched his home, they found only blood stains and wine bottles filled with blood. No one has lived in the house since, and while taxes are paid, the owner is nowhere to be found. To this day, rumors persist that the vampire Jacques Saint-Germain still prowls the streets of the French Quarter. 6. The Grunch. The urban legend of the Grunch in eastern New Orleans is a chilling tale on multiple levels. During the early stages of New Orleans development, the eastern suburbs were characterized by an ominous road and dense woodlands. It was rumored that an eerie and terrifying presence lurked within. As the legend goes, a peculiar group of humans known as the Grunch resided within these woods. Consisting of albinos and dwarfs, they were forced to live on the fringes of society due to widespread ignorance and the belief that they were created by the devil. In isolation, the Grunch allegedly interbred and transformed into monstrous, cannibalistic creatures that prey on livestock and even lure unsuspecting travelers out of their vehicles to consume them. 7. Rougarou. The rougarou, a monster native to southern Louisiana, also known as the loup-garou, has been a part of local lore since the early days of settlement in the region. Similar to werewolves, rougarous are said to take the form of dogs. They wander the streets at night, pestering people until someone puts an end to them. Legend has it that if you kill a rougarou, you must keep it a secret for a whole year or risk becoming one yourself. These creatures are said to appear in small towns throughout Louisiana, where rumors spread quickly and secrets are hard to keep. 8. Madame Minercanal. Located in the Marigny district of New Orleans, the old house on Royal Street has a haunting story. Madame Minercanal, a Creole lady, climbed the stairs to the third floor and took her own life by hanging herself from a beam. Before she died, she also killed her beloved pet, a small white dog. Children who walk the halls have reported seeing her ghost, and one child claimed to have been slapped by her for being insolent. She is always described as a woman in white accompanied by a little white dog. Allen from Philippine folklore. The Allen are deformed spirits from the folklore of the Tinguian tribe of the Philippines. They have wings and can fly, their fingers and toes point backwards. Allen appears mostly human, but they sport a pair of wings that allow them to fly. As they age, their skin begins to wrinkle, and in one instance, an old Allen was described with skin as thick as a carabao hide. They have long fingers and toes with long, sharp nails. Their hands and feet are backwards, with their fingers fastened at the wrist and their toes fastened at the heel. When they walk, their toes spread, and they bend over double. While not an explicitly all-female species, Alans are always referred to as mothers or girls in folk tales, implying that they may only have one gender. The Alan are said to take drops of menstrual blood, miscarried fetuses, after birth, or other reproductive waste and transform them into human children, whom they then raise as their own. They live near springs in extremely fine houses, made of gold and other valuables. Humans created by Alan have supernatural abilities and are sometimes described winning battles with formidable opponents even as children. They will also often defeat evil spirits that have been troubling towns. Folk heroes often introduce themselves as the child of an Alan in order to imply that they are more powerful than an average human. Their reason for creating and adopting human children like this is usually because they have no children of their own and so have no one to inherit their possessions. After reuniting their children with their birth family, the Alan will bestow upon the family great riches. They will also give the family the golden house that they live in, which usually appears in the family's town the next day. The Alan then flies away and is usually not heard from again. A legend from Costa Rica. My father, Don Pepe Arauz, told me that very few knew the story of Mataperos, an ill-fitting nickname that was given to Cleto Herrera, a strange man who, from time to time, came to the quiet and peaceful Nicoya at the turn of the 19th century. Mataperos was a very tall, very old, stocky, and bald man. He always walked with a staff and a sack in which he carried strange and mysterious things, said the children and young lads, saying that they were terrified of him. They were afraid because, when disobedient youngsters did some mischief, the parents immediately threatened them to turn them into Mataperos so he would eat them roasted in his old shack in El Zorro, a remote place in those times and currently the thriving town of Cametal. No one knew where Mataperos came from. Some said that he was Nicaraguan, others said that he was Spanish, and more than one thought that he was Guatemalan, but no one knew his origin for sure, much less who his family was. What some affirmed was that Mataperos had been a priest who, for never known reasons, left the priesthood and threw his ministry away. This is because they often found him on the corners of the old Nicoya saying prayers for the dead and perfectly singing parts of the Mass in Latin and Spanish. The more daring said that Mataperos was a warlock, since many times they lassoed him to ride him like a bull and no skillful rider could stay on the back of the mysterious Mataperos. He bucked 3 times, and the rider who dared to ride him ended up on the ground. He always bet a bottle of guaro, sugarcane liquor, and always won the bet. Over time came the news saying that Mataperos had finally died in Puerto Carrillo after a long and prolonged agony. The most elderly estimated him to be over 100 years old, since they said that by the War of 1856 Mataperos was already a grown man. People always said that he had dealings with the devil and that as punishment he died by parts. His legs died first, and when he had rotten from the waist down, he could still move his arms and blink grimaces. It was long the time they left him without giving him a Christian burial due to the fear of burying him alive. Most people are familiar with the story of the Pied Piper. There are several versions of the legend, and although the details vary slightly, the premise is always the same. The city of Hamelin is suffering a plague of rats. A mysterious stranger wearing colorful, pied, clothing appears, claiming that he can help, and is hired for a specific sum. The stranger plays his magic flute, which causes all the rats to follow him. The piper leads the rats to their doom, in some versions into the river, in some versions it's unspecified, and comes back to collect his fee. However, the city refuses to pay him. Furious, the piper again plays his flute, except this time it's the town's children who follow him. He leads the children away, and neither they nor the piper are ever seen again. What many people don't realize is that this dark tale seems to be based off of a very real and tragic episode in Hamelin's past. A plaque on Hamelin's Pied Piper house, which dates to 1602, reads, AD 1284, on the 26th of June, the day of St. John and St. Paul, 130 children, born in Hamelin, were led out of the town by a piper wearing multicolored clothes. After passing the Calvary near the Koppenberg, they disappeared forever. There are historical accounts of a stained glass window dating to 1300 in St. Nikolai's Church showing the Pied Piper leading the children away, inscribed with the words on the day of John and Paul, 130 children in Hamelin went to Calvary and were brought through all kinds of danger to the Koppen mountain and lost. The window was destroyed in the 1600s. An account dating to 1450 known as the Lüneburg manuscript tells of a monk who states that a man in his 30s wearing multicolored clothes came to the town and led the children away. Perhaps the earliest account of what really happened in Hamelin is a note in the town's ledger from 1384, stating, "It is 100 years since our children left." What's notable about all of these accounts is that the date is always the same, the feast of St. John and St. Paul, June 26, of 1284, and the number of children, 130, is likewise consistent. So what actually happened in Hamelin? Some theories suggest that the piper was actually a recruiter who was organizing migrants and used his colorful clothing and pipe to attract potential settlers. Possible locations for this migration include Transylvania or Berlin, where family names common in Hamelin show up with surprising frequency. Another theory suggests that the piper was recruiting children for a crusade. Some speculate that the story is a metaphor for a plague that came and wiped out the children, and the piper is a stand-in for death, although the question remains why no adults were affected. A fascinating theory involves what's known as dancing mania, a form of mass hysteria. According to the BBC, the dance could spread from individuals to large groups, all driven by an unshakable compulsion to dance feverishly, sometimes for weeks, often leaping and singing, and sometimes hallucinating to the point of exhaustion and occasionally death, like a top that can't stop spinning. There was actually a documented case of dancing mania in the 13th century in the town of Erfurt, south of Hamelin, where several children literally danced themselves to death. One more theory has to do with the date the children disappeared. Besides being a Christian feast day, June 26 was the date of the pagan midsummer celebrations. Some scholars suggest that the children were being led to the festivities when a local Christian faction, hoping to wipe out the pagan practices, either intercepted the group and slaughtered them or kidnapped them and forced them into monasteries. It's likely the truth about what happened in Hamelin will never be known for sure. What's sure is that the piper, whoever or whatever he was, had a larger impact on the world than anyone could ever have thought at the time. I was born in Oulu, a city in northern Finland. There are some cool folk ghost stories here. We had a castle with a very unfortunate fate. The castle was built by the King of Sweden, when Finland was part of Sweden in the 17th century. First the castle was struck by lightning, which started a fire that spread the city. They rebuilt the castle, but 100 years later the Russians burned it down again in the Great Northern War. Now we have ruins left. When the castle was still active, a Finnish male, which was locked into the cellar of the castle. When they went to get him to be burned alive, guards found him dead, and his face was all scratched. Mystery still exists today about what happened to him. He has been haunting the castle ruins ever since. In the 19th century, they built a stargazing tower above the ruins, and sailor students studied navigation there. In the beginning of the 20th century, the stargazing tower was turned into a cafe. In the 1920s, there was a story of a woman who was running away from her abusive husband with her young lover. Husband found out about this and shot his wife. When the lover found out, in his grief he climbed into the tower and jumped. They say he still haunts the premises. Gold Camp Road. There used to be a set of tunnels that would take you through the mountains of Colorado. This used to be one of the only ways to cross to a certain area. From what I remember, the story goes that one day there was a bus full of children going on a field trip from what is now Colorado Springs. They're on their merry way, headed up through the mountains. The journey continues until they reach the third tunnel on Gold Camp Road. While going through the tunnel, it collapsed, killing all like 18 children. I seriously don't remember the real number, and the teacher. Super tragic. Fast forward some years, and it's what I'll call modern time since it's 2021 now and this was like the 70s or 80s. I'd if that's correct, but you get the point. There is a family going through the third tunnel of Gold Camp, and again the tunnel starts to collapse. The car is lagging forward at an alarming pace outside of the tunnels, just before the tunnel caves in on itself. The man and his wife and family get out of the car, not really believing what happened. The man then goes to inspect his car for damage. You know what he found on the back of his dusty old Ford? Embellishment, no clue the make or model? 18 tiny sets of kid-sized handprints. The story goes that the spirits of those kids live in the tunnels and saved this man and his family, which consisted of small school-aged children. The tunnel is closed off to cars and humans now, but you can make it up the road via hike to about 10 feet from its entrance. I'm Indigenous and from Canada's northwest coast. My favorite local myth is about the story of Raven stealing the sun. When the world was young and all was dark, there lived an old man who stored light in a chest and kept it all to himself. Raven hears about this and naturally wants it for himself. He goes to near where the old man lives and turns himself into a seed, or maybe a berry? It's been a while, where the old man's daughter is gathering. She eats the food, and Raven turns into a child in her stomach. Eventually he is born and is much beloved by the woman and his grandfather. He is drawn to the chest, and eventually, one day, the old man opens the chest for him to see. Immediately, he drops his disguise, takes the sun up in his beak, and flies away, but he is pursued by an eagle. I forget if the eagle is supposed to be the old man or eagle the spirit, and drops it, breaking it into pieces, which become the stars and the moon. Finally, Raven casts it into the sky, where it becomes the sun. There are some different versions of this myth, and I haven't heard it told since I was a young child, so I might be misremembering some things. The 13 Steps to Hell in Washington. The 13 Steps is a scary urban legend about Maltby Cemetery in Washington. They say that these 13 steps lead down to hell. There used to be a staircase that began at ground level and descended down under the earth in Maltby Cemetery. It was said to be a low-grade entrance to the tomb of a wealthy local family. According to the legend, you had to go to the cemetery late at night and walk down these 13 steps. While descending the steps, you wouldn't be able to hear anything. Once you had reached the bottom, if you turned around, you would be confronted by a vision of hell. They say that the vision would drive you insane. Those who watched people perform this ritual said that they witnessed the person stop at the bottom, turn around, and then collapse to their knees in horror. According to some reports, several children emerged nearly comatose from the steps. Many of them never uttered another word. The 13 steps no longer exist. As the story goes, they were bulldozed or filled in with concrete years ago. Since then, there have been severe no trespassing limitations on the cemetery, and even rumors of kids making expeditions late at night to Maltby Cemetery, armed with shovels, hoping to unearth the 13 steps down to hell. I heard about a creepy experience in Beverly. It's not an urban legend, just weird. It happened about 20 years ago. It was winter, and it was getting darker early. My friend was walking down by Dane Street Beach with another friend, whose family is from Egypt. A group of boys came walking toward them. They were being really loud and obnoxious. Leading the group was a tall, pale man in a black trench coat. My friend reported that as soon as they got near the group, he got a terrible feeling, hair standing up on the back of the neck, goosebumps, upset stomach, cold sweat, terror, etc. His Egyptian friend felt the same way. They said the tall man then looked down at them and smiled. They were both beyond freaked out and walked on their way as quickly as possible to get the duck out because something was just not right. As soon as they got back to his friend's house, the phone was ringing off the hook. It was his friend's aunt calling long distance from Egypt. Note that the family living in Egypt didn't call the States all that often. His aunt is a nun in a Coptic Christian community. She was very upset and had called to say that great evil had passed close to him that night. Something had compelled her to call and warn him and make sure he was okay. My friend told me this story the day it happened. He and his Egyptian friend were completely shook. They were legit freaked out and falling over themselves to tell everyone what happened and about the phone call. Anyway, Dane Street Beach in Beverly, I'm sure it's great, but I don't go there. My grandfather moved to a rural area in the Midlands, not long after my dad was born. He worked for the Forestry Service and was a tree surgeon. One day a farmer over the road asks him to cut back some hawthorn and blackthorn trees encroaching on this man's land. He said he'd pay my grandfather well for it. My grandfather obliged, and the next morning he went down to the field and started cutting into the trees. He broke a saw on one of the branches and decided to take a scythe to it. The scythe apparently bounced back from the branch. The branch then turned and slapped him in the head. My grandfather just got the duck out of Dodge. Later he relayed the story to another neighbor, who then informed him that the trees he was asked to cut down were part of a fort, but the way the fort was positioned and the sheer size of it, he could only see one quadrant of it. So yeah, that's one of many stories I have about the fairy folk/fairy forts. In the county where I live, there is a particular road that is shrouded in mystery, and this road has become a popular attraction for teenagers and the youth of the area, especially in the fall and closer to Halloween. This road is called the Devil's Road, as it has many dark myths circulating around its ominous properties. For one, the trees that hide the road from overlooking eyes seem to aggressively grow away from it, as if repelled by some sort of evil presence. As the years wane on, the road has fallen into disrepair and thus has become shattered and cracked, at some points even broken by the roots of the creeping old trees. To add to the air of trespass you bring by your arrival, the road is covered in the graffiti of vandals on any leaning branch or sign that lays along the path. The tales that surround the infamous road are numerous, but three particular stories are most prevalent. One is the old baby skull tree, which is a great tree that is dead year long, with its exposed roots forming into the horrific visage of a baby's skull. The DuPont family is very big in this area, and legends go about that the remains of one of their inbred spawn were buried there in its infancy. Since then, the roots are tainted by the evil of the abandoned body. Another popular legend is the cultist house that rests just off the middle of the road. The house, which is seen to be a massive manor just barely visible from the roadside due to an obscuring hill, has gargoyles along its roof, and the windows bear inverted crosses. The stories range that the home is a hosting site for a satanic cult, or even more logically, the Ku Klux Klan. This place alone has its varying accounts and stories of bonfires with hooded fiends and bodies of animals found in the woods cased in bronze with torn open organs. Needless to say, the fantasy runs wild about the tales of the cult house. Outside of the gatehouse to the long driveway that leads up to the house sits a trifecta of red trucks, usually one or two missing at different times of the day. People say that these are security vehicles for whatever organization holds ownership of the house. These trucks are notorious for chasing visitors off the road. Most nights, they drive up right behind you with their lights off and then turn on their high beams suddenly. They pursue trespassers until the road ends and then disappear as quickly as they arrived. Those who say they pulled their cars to the side or stopped them claim that the pursuers will wait with their beams on until they vanish, most likely as a warning not to return. There are plenty of stories that circle Devil's Road, but one thing is certain: most of the tales are simply made up nonsense and superstition. The owner of the cult house has been interviewed and asked about his residence before, and it has been revealed that he is just an old widower living his days out in his home. The residents of the road have hired a security guard to protect it from vandals who seek a thrill by damaging the surrounding properties and residences by drawing graffiti and stealing, and perhaps this is the phantom pursuer that people claim to be the cult house guards. The baby tree has been filled with cement at its roots in order to dissuade curious travelers from taking time to go see it. All in all, the legends alone are an entertaining treat for Halloween Eves. The myth originated in Mexico, but La Llorona, the crying woman, is said to be seen near bodies of water, including the stretch of the Colorado River that runs through Arizona. In short, La Llorona is the ghost of a woman who drowned her children in a fit of rage after finding out her husband had been unfaithful. She appears at night to weep over her losses. A coworker of mine told a story about an encounter. Her family had been living in a house near the Colorado River. Her son was an infant at the time and slept in a crib across from the bed, beneath a window. My coworker said that one night she was startled awake and sat up before freezing because the moonlight through the window was shining on a strange woman who was standing over her son's crib. The woman looked at the sleeping baby, then looked up at her before vanishing. My coworker said that she believes it was La Llorona, whose wailing was quieted for a night by the sight of a sleeping baby. Oregon's Cursed Crater Lake. In June of 1853, John Wesley Hillman became the first white man to ever lay eyes upon the lake, which was so beautiful and mesmerizing with its magnificent blue water that he named it Deep Blue Lake, and further awe-inspired expeditions to the area by outsiders would variously call it Blue Lake and Majestic Lake. Yet although this was the first record of Crater Lake by outsiders, the native Klamath people of the region were well acquainted with it, and the lake is a sacred place to them that has since time unremembered had a prominent place within their folklore and legends. According to one such legend, the creation of Crater Lake is considered to be the result of an epic, fiery battle between two powerful spirits that resided on the volcanoes Mount Mazama and Mount Shasta. In the legend, Lao, who was the evil great spirit of the below world, lived on Mount Mazama and was mortal enemies with Skell, who was the benevolent great spirit of the above world and lived on California's Mount Shasta. The two had had many altercations before, but during one particularly violent confrontation, the two great gods caused the earth itself to tremble, shake, and rupture as they hurled fire and rocks at each other in a fury, scorching the land and sky with fiery black ash and smoke. This battle would boom across the land for days before finally it is said that Skell defeated Lao and banished the malicious spirit down to the below world, collapsing Mount Mazama in the process in order to imprison him there for all eternity. The battle-worn Skell then looked upon the gaping crater that had formed and decided to fill it with magnificent blue water so that it may become a symbol of peace throughout the land in the wake of such death, destruction, and darkness. From then on, pretty blue water or not, the lake was seen by the native people as a sort of doorway or crossroads between the darkness of the below world, which was more or less their version of hell, and the light of the above world. According to the legend, only Lao's head remains visible as one of the lake's islands, Wizard Island, and the vengeful spirit is said to still inhabit this speck of land. In fact, Wizard Island was seen as a place to which wicked souls were banished, and these damned took on the form of winged salamanders that prowled and haunted the island. The Klamath also believed that it was unwise to stare too long at the lake's surface, as it was thought to mesmerize and trap people, as well as channel great sorrow and dread into those who gazed upon it, unable to look away, and lure people towards it to their death. This is perhaps the origin of one of the native names for the lake, Lost Lake. Other local tribes, such as the Modoc, believed the lake to be a cursed place of festering evil and avoided it at all costs, saying it was inhabited by malevolent spirits and the souls of the damned and that various supernatural entities stalked through the dark surrounding forests. Photographers don't seem to have much luck at Crater Lake, because probably one of the most bizarre and baffling unexplained disappearances of the lake is that of a Virginia-based photographer by the name of Charles McCullough in 1975. In 1974, Charles embarked on an adventurous hitchhiking and bus tour of the country, which he hoped to take a photographic journal of. January of 1975 found Charles staying at the home of a friend in Oregon for a few weeks, during which time he decided to take the opportunity to go take some wintertime photos of Crater Lake. It seemed like a normal thing for the intrepid adventurer and photographer to do, so his friend thought nothing of it when Charles said he would be back in a few days before heading into the wilderness. It would be the last time anyone would see him alive. There have been numerous other disappearances reported from the Crater Lake area. In 1971, Nick Carlino of Grants Pass, Oregon, went out snowshoeing along with his pet German Shepherd dog just west of Rim Village. When the dog later returned without its master, a search was launched, which followed the man's snowshoe prints to the edge of the rim of the crater, where they abruptly stopped. No trace of the man was ever found. This case is eerily similar to another, more recent case from 2009, when a man whose identity has been withheld rented snowshoes, hiked out to the edge of the caldera rim, and stepped off the face of the earth. Again, prints led to the edge and disappeared. Authorities believe that he had fallen over the precipitous ledge and then plummeted 1,000 feet down the yawning chasm below to his death. Yet when a search team scoured the area where he was expected to have fallen, there was no trace of him or his belongings. Searchers on boats dredged the bottom of the lake, and divers scoured the lake as well, but no sign of the man, his belongings, or even his snowshoes was ever found. Adding to the mysterious disappearances and deaths are the many odd endings that have occurred at Crater Lake. In July of 1947, a park visitor named Mr. Cornelius was out for a day of hiking with his wife. By all accounts, the two were perfectly happy and nothing had seemed out of the ordinary, but at one point during their hike, Mr. Cornelius suddenly stopped hiking, calmly handed his wife his billfold, and without saying a word, proceeded to emotionlessly sit down and slide over the edge of a steep snow bank leading down to the lake. The man survived the fall with only a broken leg, but then staggered to his feet, hobbled to the lake's edge, and drowned himself as his horrified wife looked on. The wife would later claim that he had been in a sort of daze or trance during the incident. Other endings have involved people hiking out into the woods to shoot themselves or others hurling themselves over the edge of the rim, and in many of these cases the victims have been found to have been content, well-adjusted people who did not fit in with the profile of someone in danger of killing themselves. Even more frightening and spectacular are the deaths that the lake seems to almost feed off of that come not from the land around it but from the sky above, and there have been many strange cases of aircraft mysteriously going down and even vanishing in the area. Such bizarre aircraft fatalities and disappearances have been recorded here since at least the 1940s, in the wake of the construction of an airbase at Klamath Falls. In the spring of 1944, two Grumman torpedo planes were flying in formation when one of the pilots turned and found the other plane was simply gone, and it was later determined to have inexplicably crashed into the lake and sunk to the bottom despite clear conditions and no sign of trouble. Later that same year, in fall, a flight trainer along with his gunner flew off to the north of the lake and were never seen again, with no sign of the men, the plane, or even a scrap of wreckage ever found. In another odd case from 1945, 7 Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter planes were on their way to Washington from Redding, California, when they entered a bank of clouds near Crater Lake. When the planes emerged from the clouds, they found one of the planes had completely vanished. In addition to mysterious disappearances, deaths, and air disasters, Crater Lake is home to a variety of other weirdness as well. Strange lights are said to flit about Wizard Island at night, and park rangers have often told of seeing what appear to be campfires burning on the island yet which produce no smoke and which leave no evidence that anyone had been there burning a fire at all. Natives maintain that these are the spirits of the island and also claim that the waters around the island are the realm of spirits that take the form of dragon-like beasts. Some people have indeed reported seeing large, dark shapes swimming under the mirror-like surface of the water, as well as mysterious ripples or large splashes on the placid surface, and one woman by the name of Maddie Hatcher allegedly had a very close encounter with one of these huge mystery beasts when a massive black shape swam right under her boat as she was out on the lake with her family. The woman later described the encounter as follows. "I have never been so scared in my life. What we saw that day was a monster. To me, it looked like a dragon. I know why the Indians call that place Lost Lake. They say monsters live there. I believe them. I know, because I saw one there." To top off all of this high strangeness are the many cases of UFOs spotted in the skies over Crater Lake. In one particularly dramatic account, in February of 1997, a private pilot claimed that he witnessed military jets pursuing a UFO over the lake, and later that night there was a massive boom that was so loud it could be heard across western Oregon, and it was widely reported in the local news at the time. Other UFOs have been witnessed flying in formation in the skies over the lake, doing impossible maneuvers, buzzing over the tree line, and even entering and exiting the water. Some UFOs have even been reported to have seemingly gone into Mount Mazama itself, which has of course led to far-out theories of mountain UFO bases or secret advanced underground civilizations. An Amarok, or Amarok, is a gigantic wolf in Inuit religion, said to stalk and devour any person foolish enough to hunt alone at night. Unlike wolves who hunt in packs, Amaroks hunt alone. It casts an imposing figure, and it is believed to be a gigantic wolf with razor-sharp teeth with exceptional predatory instincts. The Amarok wolf's powers relate to its size. Because of its gigantic form, it has incredible strength and is a fearsome foe. It is also an adept hunter, with extremely heightened senses that allow it to hunt unsuspecting humans during the night. In one tale, a persecuted and physically stunted boy seeks to increase his strength. When he calls out to the Lord of Strength, an Amarok appears and wrestles him to the ground with its tail. This causes a number of small bones to fall from the boy's body. The Amarok tells the boy that the bones had prevented his growth. He instructs him to return daily in order to develop his strength. After several days of wrestling with the Amarok, the boy is strong enough to overcome 3 large bears, thus gaining the esteem of his village. In another story, a man mourning the death of a relative hears reports that an Amarok is nearby. He and a relative go in search of the Amarok. Instead, they find her puppies, and the mourner puts them all to rest. The grieving relative becomes frightened. The two retreat to hide in a cave. Looking out, they see the adult Amarok returning to her pups, carrying a reindeer in her mouth. When the Amarok fails to find her offspring, she hastens to a nearby lake and drags a humanoid form from the water. At that moment, the mourner collapses. The Amarok, from which nothing remains concealed, took the mourner's soul from his body. Around a month ago, me, 16 meters, and my cousin, 17 meters, my dad, 47 meters, and my uncle, 43 meters, went camping at a swamp in a small town in the hill towns of western Massachusetts. Me and my dad live in this town, and we have land where we are building a house. The swamp sits in a small valley with land on top of the ridge, and a small dirt road goes from the main road past the land all the way to the swamp. We intend to take 3 kayaks and a canoe to the campsite on the swamp, but we only had 3 kayaks and 2 paddles, so we loaded the 3 kayaks and tied the other kayak to another kayak, and my dad and my uncle paddled them out to the campsite. Me and my cousin had to cross the beaver dam to get to the other side of the swamp for the campsite. This side of the swamp I'm less fond of as it is more dark and seems to be more spirited than the side with the land, but I know there is a worn and game trail that goes from the beaver dam right to the campsite. The trail goes right on the edge of the water. Me and my cousin took the trail with our backpacks and fishing poles all the way to the little peninsula with the campsite, which is about 500 to 600 yards from the beaver dam, and we're putting the kayaks in. Around 9 p.m. around the fire we decided to pack up and go back to the land as the forecast got a lot worse and was supposed to start downpouring at around 3 a.m. We got all the kayaks loaded up, and me and my cousin got our backpacks, fishing poles, and tackle box and left to go back down the bank of the swamp on the trail. As soon as me and my cousin got on the trail and off the peninsula, all the frogs and bugs stopped completely, and it got cold. My cousin put some upbeat music on with his phone, and our phones were the only lights we had. After 100 feet down the trail, I was in Fort as my cousin is from Maine, but after about 150 feet down the trail, I started to hear my friend talking at the top of the ridge/hill off to my right, and the swamp was on the left. I thought I was just working myself up as it was very dark and it was a pine forest. After another 50 feet, I lost track of the trail and my dad and uncle who were on the water, and I could see them before because of their light, but I couldn't see them anymore, and the trail I was just on completely disappeared. It was a varied trail, and me and my cousin had already walked it 3 times beforehand, but it completely disappeared, so we went 10 feet up the hill, and I found it again after a couple of minutes, so we continued along the trail that was right next to the water. Soon after, me and my cousin both started hearing movement all around us, but we both didn't say a word about it. We continued down the trail, and we came to this split tree, and at the base of the tree was a skull of an alligator and a deer mixed together, but it wasn't there the 3 other times we walked by the tree, so we then started to hastily move down the trail. At this time my cousin started to hear his friend calling for her dog and also saw a couple dark spots run around us. We soon came to a thick part of the trail, so I went first, and my cousin was 10 feet behind me. Out of nowhere, the fishing pole got hooked onto my backpack, and as I was cutting them off, they got perfectly stuck under my cousin's armpit. When that happened, both of our friends' voices got louder, and after I cut them off, We went faster down the trail, and the trail stared looking a lot different, and eventually we made it backpack, and as I was cutting them off, they got perfectly stuck under my cousin's armpit. When that happened, both of our friends' voices got louder, and after I cut them off, we went faster down the trail, and the trail stared looking a lot different, and eventually we made it back to the dam. Right as my dad and uncle got there and me and my cousin went back up to our land, we started talking about it because the whole time we didn't say a word to each other. After recently talking to my other uncle about it, it sounds like Pukwudgies got us. South Dakota, there's an area that we always refer to as the Bermuda Triangle of South Dakota. Loosely spanning from Sisseton to the Millbank exit on 29 to Wabash. I can't tell you how many times it's been a beautiful day and then you enter this area and the weather is awful and immediately turns nice again several miles down the road. Area feels off when you're in it half the time too. At one point, I was working with a guy who was ex-law enforcement but was still working with law enforcement using /training cadaver dogs, who stated that this area of SD is where they find the bodies of 2/3 RDS of people that are missing in the state, and several that are out of state. He told me about a rumor/legend of a wailing woman that people saw and that he believed he saw two on one occasion. If I remember correctly, the wailing woman is a young, late teen/early 20s, Native American woman stumbling around near sloughs in tattered clothes/various stages of forced undress and screaming. He had told me that the time he believes he and a couple of officers saw her, they had found the body of a young, missing Native American girl in the slough next to where they saw the wailing woman. He could have been one of the most incredible bullshitters I've ever met, but his demeanor and 1,000-yard look in his eyes have stuck with me for years. It is worth noting that this area is on the Lake Traverse Reservation, and some reservations have a history of missing women, which I'm sure this legend stems from. I asked my wife if she was aware of any legends or creatures, and she offered up the Lake Campesca monster but didn't really have much information to offer. The Thunderbird of Native Americans. The Thunderbird is a widespread figure in Native American mythology in the United States and Canada. Described as a supernatural being, the enormous bird symbolized power and strength that protected humans from evil spirits. It was called the Thunderbird because the flapping of its powerful wings sounded like thunder, and lightning would shoot out of its eyes. The Thunderbirds brought rain and storms, which could be good or bad. Good, when the rain was needed, or bad, when the rain came with strong destructive winds, floods, and fires caused by lightning. The bird was so enormous that several legends say it picked up a whale in its talons. They were said to have bright and colorful feathers, sharp teeth, and claws. They were said to live in the clouds high above the tallest mountains. Various tribes have different oral traditions about the magical Thunderbird, which they both highly respected and feared. According to Gros Ventre traditions, it was the Thunderbird who gave the sacred pipe to the people. Some Plains tribes, including the Arapaho, associated Thunderbirds with the summer season, while White Owl represented the winter season. In Algonquian mythology, the Thunderbird controls the upper world. In contrast, the underworld is controlled by the underwater panther or great horned serpent, from which the Thunderbird protects humans by throwing lightning at it. According to their legends, the Thunderbirds were ancestors of the human race and helped to create the universe. The Menominee of Wisconsin tells of a great mountain that floats in the western sky, upon which the Thunderbirds live. From there, they control the rain. They are the enemies of the great horned snakes, called the Mississauga, which they fight with to prevent them from overrunning the earth and devouring mankind. They are said to be messengers of the great sun himself and delight in deeds of greatness. The Ojibwe version is similar in that the Thunderbirds fight underwater spirits. Their traditions also say the Thunderbird is responsible for punishing humans who break moral rules. They said that the bird was created by Nanabasho, a high spirit and cultural hero, and that the birds lived in the four directions and migrated to Ojibwe lands during the spring with other birds. They stayed until the fall, when the most dangerous season for the underwater spirits had passed when they migrated south with other birds. The Winnebago says that a man with a vision of a Thunderbird during a solitary fast will become a war chief. They also believe that the Thunderbird has the power to grant people extraordinary abilities. The Thunderbird of the Sioux people was a noble creature that protected humans from the Untahila, who were dangerous reptilian monsters. Some believe they were shapeshifters who often changed their appearance to interact with people. To the Shawnee tribe, they appeared as boys and could be identified by their tendency to speak backward. In some tribes, Thunderbirds were considered highly sacred forces of nature, while others were treated like powerful but otherwise ordinary members of the animal kingdom. Many legends reference the anger of the Thunderbirds as something fearsome to behold, which could result in harsh punishments. In one story, an entire village was turned to stone for their wrongdoings. Some say that the mythology began with the ancient mound builders. Throughout history, The Thunderbird symbol has appeared on totem poles, pottery, petroglyphs, masks, jewelry, and carvings. The legends have been told through songs and oral histories. Ierland. I live in a lovely spot in the south of the country. There's little light pollution as I'm well out in the sticks. As you can imagine, the sky out here is beautiful, and after moving in, I would spend a lot of time outside when it got dark. It wasn't long before I began to notice spheres of light, pretty much the only way I can describe them, that would race across the sky, zigzag, drop down from nowhere, and ascend to the same place. After a while, I would see them in the late evenings. It's quite hard to explain, and I know it sounds ridiculous, but I would be drawn to an area of the sky, and sure enough one would be there, many times stationary, then they would slowly trail off. They could be big or small, fast or slow, but the color was always the same. I told my family, and they of course thought I was insane. Until they came to visit and spent 3 nights outside watching them with an unsettled curiosity. Most times, I was in awe and disbelief. A couple of times, however, a feeling of absolute discomfort drove me inside. After a while, I befriended an elderly man who was staying deeper out in the countryside with an old friend of his, and I would often give him a lift back and forth when he needed it. He was the first to bring it up. He asked if I had seen any UFOs. I said no, but tried instead to explain the lights, as I didn't really consider them to be flying crafts. I did and do, however, think that they were moving freely and independently. He assured me that everyone out that way had seen them and knew about them. I asked what they were, and he said some kind of entity. I'm a nerd who enjoys stargazing, and I always have. I know what a plane looks or sounds like and what a satellite looks or moves like, but these lights are neither of those. After having a few chats with some neighbors and a farmer who owns quite a lot of land around here, I came to find out that there are 2 fairyforts to the left, one off to the right, and one a little off to the front of my house. 3 of them are on his, the farmer's, land, and the 4th is on the land of another farmer. Now, he takes them very seriously. According to my neighbors, he warned them not to go near the fort in the field at the back of their house, and in his words, if you interfere with it, they'll kill my cattle and you have to respect their traditions. He himself told me that whenever he's digging within close proximity, he'd often hear ringing, as if there were tunnels underground connecting the forts. He's not an old rambling lunatic, he's a young man with a very straight and direct way of carrying on. Never would I have ever dreamed he would open up about that. A car passed by and disrupted our conversation before I could ask if the lights and forts are connected in some way. Not sure if he would have known or given an answer if he had, but it has left me so curious. Additional info. I was fed a ton of stories about the fairies growing up, ghost stories too. I've had quite a lot of strange and, at times, very terrifying experiences. I think once they've copped on that you are aware, it spreads, leaving you very open, even more so if you're sensitive to such things. Werewolf from various folklore. In folklore, a werewolf, or occasionally lycanthrope, is a human with the ability to shapeshift into a wolf, either purposely or after being placed under a curse or affliction, often a bite or scratch from another werewolf, with the transformations occurring on the night of a full moon. Belief in werewolves developed in parallel to belief in witches in the course of the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. Like the witchcraft trials as a whole, the trial of supposed werewolves emerged in what is now Switzerland. The transformation may be temporary or permanent, the were-animal may be the man himself metamorphosed, may be his double, whose activity leaves the real man to all appearance unchanged, may be his soul, which goes forth seeking whomever it may devour, leaving its body in a state of trance, or it may be no more than the messenger of the human being, a real animal or a familiar spirit, whose intimate connection with its owner is shown by the fact that any injury to it is believed, by a phenomenon known as repercussion, to cause a corresponding injury to the human being. Werewolves were said in European folklore to bear telltale physical traits even in their human form. These included the meeting of both eyebrows at the bridge of the nose, curved fingernails, low-set ears, and a swinging stride. One method of identifying a werewolf in its human form was to cut the flesh of the accused under the pretense that fur would be seen within the wound. A Russian superstition recalls a werewolf can be recognized by bristles under the tongue. After returning to their human forms, werewolves are usually documented as becoming weak, debilitated, and undergoing painful nervous depression. One universally reviled trait in medieval Europe was the werewolf's habit of devouring recently buried corpses. Drinking rainwater out of the footprint of the animal in question or from certain enchanted streams was also considered an effective mode of accomplishing metamorphosis. In Italy, France, and Germany, it was said that a man or woman could turn into a werewolf if he or she, on a certain Wednesday or Friday, slept outside on a summer night with the full moon shining directly on his or her face. In other cases, The transformation was supposedly accomplished by satanic allegiance for the most loathsome ends. Sai Kung Barrier/Portal. There is an urban legend in China about a particular area called Sai Kung, which is to the northeast of Hong Kong. It's a beautiful peninsula area with lots of beaches and very popular for hiking. From what I read, it is believed there is some kind of mythic barrier, portal, or bad feng shui around the area. There's been a few strange disappearances and deaths in the area. I've posted the ones I found below. In 2005, the body of a man was found in dense bushes off a hiking trail. It was suspected he fell and hit his head on some rocks. The most famous incident, which was later made into a Chinese movie called Missing, occurred in September 2009. A police officer hiking in Sai Kung called 999 to report he had become lost while hiking. The operator asked for the coordinates, as all trails in China are marked with coordinates. He requests they send help, but the coordinates he provided don't match anything on record, and the operator is unsure where he actually is. The call is cut short, and the man disappears, and his body is never recovered. A month after this, a Boy Scout troop leader and 4 women were hiking close to the area where the first man disappeared. They stopped to rest, and the man told the woman to go on because he wanted to rest a bit longer. He never caught up, and 2 days later they would locate his body next to the trail. In 2009, a bus driver hiking in the same area disappeared, and his family began calling his cell phone in an attempt to contact him. It would later be answered by a fisherman who claimed to have found it in the river. A 4th man disappeared in 2011 and also called emergency services to report he was lost while hiking in Sai Kung. This call was cut off, and he later vanished as well. In 2019, a 5th hiker went missing and was later found dead laying in the grass. His death was ruled suspicious. The last death occurred in 2020 when a man was found laying on the hiking trail. It was suspected he stumbled and hit his head, similar to the first death. Sai Kung doesn't look to be a huge area, but there are lots of different hiking trails. I looked at some pictures of the trails, and some of the terrain is fairly steep and covered in jungle, so it's easy to see how you could get lost and your body not be recovered. But there are some strange things, like why couldn't they locate the coordinates and why did they step off the trail? The few trails I looked at did look pretty clearly marked and well built, but they were not exactly trekking in the wilderness. You would think a scoutmaster would have some navigational skills and knowledge on what to do if he was lost. Would a policeman also not have some training as well? I think a lot of them were also experienced hikers. In a popular hiking area, I guess you would have a lot of injuries, deaths, or missing persons, and Chinese culture can be quite superstitious, but it's still pretty interesting. There's hardly any information this online, just a few different random scattered articles. Maybe someone who is from Hong Kong or China might know a bit more or have heard of this? The Michigan Dogman Legend. My name is Daniel. I'm from northern Michigan. I've been enjoying your YouTube content for several months now, and I'm quite hooked. I think I may have a good one for Halloween. I know you've covered werewolf stories before, but in northern Michigan we have a particularly creepy legend about the Dog Man. It's a story that still continues over a century after the first sighting. The story was even made into a popular regional hit song recorded by a disc jockey in Traverse City back in the late 80s or early 90s. It's been played on the radio around Halloween for years. According to the legend, it appears every 10 years, on the 7th year of each decade, and there may be more than just one that terrorizes locals. During one of those 7th years, in 1997, I remember seeing a news report about a farmer whose cattle were ripped to pieces by some kind of large animal. Whatever it was, he left claw marks everywhere and mutilated the animals in such a way that it was obvious that no person with a knife could have done it. This really intrigued me. Below is a copy of my testimony. My Dogman sighting. In the mid-90s I had just started college at Central Michigan University, where I was studying graphic design and broadcasting, and in the summertime I would go back home to Manistee County, which was further north, on the coast of Lake Michigan. A large national forest, the Manistee National Forest, stretches throughout several counties in northwest Lower Michigan. Despite being densely forested, there are no significantly large predatory animals. There are black bears, but little else. Wolves, grizzly bears, mountain lions, etc., are practically extinct in this region. I assume it is because the southern portion of the state is more populated, with cities like Grand Rapids, Detroit, Ann Arbor, Kalamazoo, Lansing, and Saginaw all located in the lower half of the peninsula, as well as areas like Toledo and Chicago beyond that. Otherwise, the state is surrounded by the Great Lakes. The only way a large beast could enter is from the north, and it would have to cross the very large, very long, and very busy Mackinac Bridge that connects the lower and upper peninsulas. One of the things I love about Northwest Lower Michigan is that there simply isn't much of a threat of being attacked by a predator. Other than crossing a mama black bear and her cubs, the danger in these woods is relatively low. Unless you're a child, there may be a danger of coyotes or bobcats. But that's about it. We don't even have many poisonous snakes, spiders, or predatory marine life in the Great Lakes. The Lower Peninsula is one of the safest places that I know of to spend time outdoors in nature, save for this one eerie legend. My friends and I had grown up with the Dogman legend, and we had heard the famous local song written about it. According to legend, the Dogman appears every 10 years, and there are usually reports of sightings during those years. This particular year, we knew that Dogman sightings were happening. There was a story on the local news of a large creature that attacked a farmer's cattle in a nearby county, I think Wexford, and left at least one bloody carcass in this farmer's field. It was clear something enormous had ripped these animals apart. This was no prank done by humans. There were large claw marks and teeth marks on these poor animals, and I think there was some mention of a tall fence that sustained some damage by something large that had climbed over it. In any case, my friends and I were intrigued, so we would often go on dog hunts throughout that summer. I feel I should mention that these hunts were unarmed ones. We'd just drive around the local woods at night, often finding dirt roads and driving endlessly from one township to another. There is a national forest in this area, so there are thick, deep wooded areas everywhere and long stretches of miles with no signs of civilization in sight other than the 2-track road we were on. Typically we would be in my car, and I'd have 1 or 2 people with me at a time. On our trips, I would often play some haunting music, like Dead Can Dance, to make things even spookier. We'd be pretty gutsy sometimes, going so far as to park the car with the windows down and the engine off, waiting in the dark for something to show up. I don't know if we were brave or just dumb. I think there was a part of us that didn't quite believe the tales. I know I had my doubts, but like a scary book you can't put down, we would regularly go out at night and drive around just for the thrills and something to do. There's not much else to do in a small northern Michigan town when you're a teen. By the end of summer, we had not had one single Dogman sighting, although we had some spooky moments along the way that were fun. All in all, it was time well spent with friends, despite our efforts leaving us feeling a bit let down. It nearly confirmed to me that these stories were fake. I had grown up in forests my entire life and would think nothing about venturing out at night on foot, sometimes without a flashlight. I never heard so much as a dog bark or heard an animal larger than a squirrel. There's virtually no man-eating animals that live in Michigan's Lower Peninsula, even though black bears are sometimes spotted. They rarely attack people unless they're protecting their babies. I never felt I had a reason to fear the woods at night. Although these dog hunts would sometimes get the hair on my neck standing up, when my imagination got the better of me, that was part of the fun, I guess. Then, on one of the very last evenings of summer break before we all headed back to college, my best friend Tony and I decided to go out dog hunting. Tony was not one of my usual companions on these road trips. Most often it was my friend Jessica, who, despite scaring very easily, enjoyed the spooky adventure of the hunt nonetheless. Tony, on the other hand, was unafraid by the tales. I think he was probably more skeptical than I was, but he was intrigued enough to go along on a final hunting trip with me. He attended Oakland University near Detroit, so this would be the last time we would be able to spend some quality time just hanging out before the fall semester began. It was one of the few times Tony went out dog hunting with me, and it may have been the one and only time we'd ever taken his vehicle instead of mine. So on this particular night, he was driving his car, and I was in the passenger seat. The evening seemed to be going without incident. I think we mostly talked the whole time and didn't get too worked up into a fright. We had only a few days left before we parted ways to go back to our respective universities, so I think we had more interest in shooting the breeze than looking for an alleged mythical creature that probably didn't exist. We were deep into the Manistee National Forest between Manistee and Wexford counties when we decided to head back. We made it back to the main highway, M55, which is a very dark and remote stretch of wooded highway between Manistee and Cadillac, which was in the neighboring Wexford County. It's one of those highways that can almost drive you crazy at night because of the seemingly endless miles of dark forest. Even though M55 is the only main throughway between the two towns, there's not much of anything along that stretch besides a couple small villages, some bridges, and a maximum security prison. There's simply nothing out there. We weren't very far from Manistee, though not yet close enough to see the glow of the city lights in the distance. There was still thick forest on both sides of us. However, there was a car behind us with its lights shining into our cab, and 3 more cars far ahead of us on the highway with their headlights on, heading toward us. We weren't even looking for the Dogman anymore and were totally unprepared for what was about to happen next. As far as I was concerned, the night had wound down, and our last dogman hunt had come to an end. Suddenly, something large climbed out of the ditch up ahead, on the right side of the road, which was my side of the car, as I was the passenger. I don't recall Tony or I making a sound as he quickly applied the brakes, bringing his car to a slow crawl while this creature crawled onto the road in front of us. The car behind us and the ones ahead of us all did likewise. I'm sure all of us saw this thing clamber out of the ditch and onto the highway. My very first thought was that it looked like a man in a gorilla suit. However, with the other cars around us now shining their bright beams into our eyes, it was hard to make out. It walked hunched over, partly on all fours and partially upright. At times its arms seemed to be dragging low and barely making contact with the road. It looked more like an extremely tall man that was hunched over and scurrying like an animal to cross the road. I couldn't make out details as it was more of a silhouette in the bright beams of the other cars, but Tony and I could tell that whatever it was very hairy and very large. However, it was far too thin for a bear. Although my next thought was that it was perhaps a very sick, emaciated bear. But even then, it didn't move like a bear. More like a chimpanzee or a gorilla, with its hands and paws hanging low, sometimes touching the ground. Tony and I just sat in silent shock as this thing moved in front of us. We were quite close to it, as was the closest vehicle facing us. By the time Tony had slowed his car down to a snail's pace, this thing was only about 10 yards away from the hood of the vehicle. Tony was smart not to slam the brakes, as we had a car right behind us. But because we had reduced speed from 60 or 55 miles per hour to almost zero, it caused us to come upon this creature quite fast before we could safely yield. I couldn't make out the shape of its head, as it was hunched over, and by the time we were close enough to make better sense of this dark, hairy, silhouetted figure, it had already passed in front of us and was crossing in front of the opposing traffic just before it dove into the other ditch and headed for the tree line. So at our closest angle, we were looking mostly at its backside. With its head lowered, it was impossible to see its face. I wanted to get a better look at this thing before it disappeared back into the Manistee National Forest, so I told Tony to pull the car over, and he obliged without objection. Like me, he was curious to find out what his eyes had just seen, but unlike me, he didn't get out of the car. The other vehicles drove on by as we parked on the shoulder. I got out of the car immediately and walked toward the back to try to see anything. But the creature had vanished, I assumed, into the woods. I don't think I was yet convinced this wasn't just some prank, hence the bold move of exiting the vehicle in the middle of a darkened, forested road at night. But as Tony and I made our way back into town trying to figure out what the hell we had just seen, things just didn't add up in our heads. If this was a man in an animal suit of some kind, playing a prank, he was pretty foolish for leaping onto a darkened highway between two lines of traffic, traveling at least 55 miles per hour in both directions. A moment too late, and he would have been a roadkill. And where the hell did he come from? There was nothing out there. The nearest sign of human life was the prison. I never heard any reports of a prison break, but if there had been, it would have been one of the weirdest prison escapes in history. Why an animal suit? We could clearly see thick hair covering this creature. And if it was a human, it was a very tall one. Plus, there was something very non-human about the way it moved. Even though it was practically on all fours, hunched over, it appeared very long. So if it was a person, he had to be at least 7 feet tall. The back legs in particular seemed rather long and gangling. Too long to be a bear, although I wouldn't describe its entire body as being either skinny or overly muscular. This was definitely not a bear, whatever it was. After mulling it over many times in the years since, I'm convinced we saw the dog man that night. I don't rule out a Bigfoot, either, but as it was the year of the dog man, I am leaning more toward that. I don't know of many Bigfoot sightings in Michigan. If so, I've never heard one. And somewhere out there, there's at least 3 other vehicles with occupants who saw the same thing we did. If you're one of them, I'd love to hear your version of what you saw that night. As for me, I never go out in the woods at night anymore, and I rarely walk at night, even on a well-lit road. I'm from rural northeast Bedfordshire, and my nan always told me about lamp men, or lantern men. Never, ever, go towards a light you see in the distance off the bridleway or footpath. That's a lamp man. They try to lure you towards them so they can strangle you. Similarly, never use a torch when you're out and about in the countryside because you'll attract one and it'll begin to close in on you. If you realize what you've done too late and you see a light in the distance, leave your lit torch on the ground and ducking leg it. Also, don't whistle at all past twilight. Lamp men hate whistling and will follow you home with a vengeance if they hear it. I never whistled for my dog to this very day because of stories of the lamp men. Native America. Urban legends, the man with the hook. A man with a hook for a hand escapes from prison. Some teens are at Lover's Lane kissing when they hear about it on the radio. The girl becomes scared and wants to leave. The guy fights her, but they eventually make it out. When he goes to drop her off, he opens her door, and there's a rusty hook attached to the door handle. The man upstairs, a girl is babysitting when she gets a call from a man asking if she's checked on the children. She asks who it is, and he hangs up. This pattern continues several times until she finally contacts the operator to trace the call. The man calls again, and the operator calls as soon as she's off the phone with the man. The operator tells her to get out of the house immediately because the call is coming from the upstairs phone. She goes outside, and the police show up. They check upstairs, and there's a man waiting with all the children dead. The man in the back seat, a girl, is being followed by a guy with seeming road rage. It turns out he's trying to protect her from a killer with a knife in her backseat. She makes her way home, and they catch the guy. Crybaby Bridge. There's a bridge on the edge of town where a mom and her newborn baby wrecked and died, and if you go there at nighttime, you can still hear the cry of the baby. All of these stories and more like them predate cell phones and the internet and have been circulated in schools in most states since the 40s and 50s. When I was growing up, the internet was already a thing, but cell phones were still up and coming, and I heard all of these in elementary school. Cryptids. The American jackalope, a sort of rabbit with antlers. The Jersey Devil is a terrifying and lethal entity in New Jersey. There are various descriptions of what he looks like. Sasquatch, you already know this one. Chupacabra, this one is really only where Mexican immigrants reside, it's like a little goat monster thing. Skinwalker, some Native American legends depict individuals who possess the ability to transform into animals. La Mulona from Colombia. La Mulona, also known as Colmalona, is a character from Colombian mythology present in the folkloric legends of the populations located in the Andean region, Huila and Tolima, of Colombia. The woman is characterized by her teeth that always appear, for which it seems that she always smiles. Her form is that of a pretty woman with long hair and penetrating eyes, an extravagant dentition similar to that of a larger animal such as a cow or a horse. Mulona attacks the walkers that appear at the edge of the path as a very attractive and seductive woman, but when they are in her arms, they are crushed by her teeth. According to mythology, she is almost always going after gamblers, unfaithful men, and alcoholics. Mulona or Colmalona has a particularity and is that of not attacking men with a home, a pregnant wife, or with newborn children. Her favorite time to appear along the roads is between 6 in the afternoon and 8 in the evening. Of Mulona, it is said she had an extremely high libido. A Native American concept of Sasquatch you probably haven't heard. In her 1916 book, Yurok Native Woman, Lucy Thompson wrote, "The Klamath Indians, in bringing down their legends from the creation of man until the present day, say that some were made to be good and honorable, some bad, and some were real bad and mean, which they term devils, or Omaha. We have the conception of the invisible Satan, Seoth, or wicked old woman, and a real living devil such as walks the earth, and we fear them as they will harm us if they get the opportunity. We have had these living Indian devils, living human beings, all through the long and weary centuries, ever since the creation of mankind, such devils as we find in every race and nation of the earth." So, it's clear she's talking about flesh and blood creatures, and not only that, but humans. She continues, "Our Indian devils are Indians who, for some reason or cause, leave the tribe and go far away into the lonely mountains and into the depths of the forests, where they live near the streams and places almost inaccessible. In their loneliness, they roam through the forests and over the mountains like some wild animals of prey. They forget the language of their mothers and become something like wild beasts fleeing from the sight of humans. In olden times, the women, especially, were always careful to keep together on their camping trips when they were gathering the acorn crop, grass seeds, pine nuts, etc., for fear of these Indian devils. These Indian devils would sometimes watch the camps of the Indians very closely and follow them about as they moved from place to place, watching for an opportunity to seize one of the young women and carry her off to make her his wife. If a young woman strayed away too far by herself, she was often made a captive by one of these devils. The women of the tribe had great fear of them, as they had great horrors of becoming the wives of a wild man. Sometimes the women would be captivated by the Indian devils and would be gone away from their tribe for years, when they would return and tell of their wild life and experiences. They would become the mother of children, and the children would inherit the wild habits of their father, as they would always be whistling, making strange noises, romping wildly about and always on the go, roaming everywhere in the wilds. These women were never happy when they came back to their people, as after a time they would long to go back to their devil husbands and children. They always managed to get away and return to the old wild life, as it held such a fascination for them when they once experienced the wilds that they could not resist the calling of such a life. Now, You may suppose she's talking about a purported race of feral humans that have nothing to do with Sasquatch. However, hers isn't the only native nation that believes wild people abduct and mate with humans. Perhaps the strangest and most terrifying experience any Indian woman ever had with the Sasquatch was one related by a Chehalis woman named Seraphine Long. At the time Burns interviewed her, Seraphine was very old. She claimed that when she was a young girl, she was kidnapped by a giant Sasquatch and taken to the abode of the hairy monsters for nearly a year. She told Burns the story many times over. He set down her words as accurately as possible. 1. Seraphine Long's account of her abduction. I was walking toward home one day many years ago carrying a big bundle of cedar roots and thinking of the young, brave Qualic Thunderbolt, whom I was soon to marry. Suddenly, at a place where the bush grew close and thick beside the trail, a long arm shot out and a big, hairy hand was pressed over my mouth. Then I was suddenly lifted up into the arms of a young Sasquatch. I was terrified, fought, and struggled with all my might. In those days, I was strong. But it was no good, the wild man was as powerful as a young bear. Holding me easily under one arm, with his other hand he smeared tree gum over my eyes, sticking them shut so that I could not see where he was taking me. He then lifted me to his shoulder and started to run. He ran on and on for a long, long time, up and down hills, through thick brush, across many streams, never stopping to rest. Once he had to swim a river, and then perhaps I could have gotten away, but I was so afraid of being drowned that I held on tightly with my arms around his neck. Although I was frightened, I could not help but admire his effortless breathing, his outstanding strength, and his speed of foot. After reaching the other side of the river, he began to climb and climb. Presently, the air has become very cold. I could not see, but I guessed that we were close to the top of a mountain. At last the Sasquatch stopped hurrying, then he stooped over and moved slowly as if feeling his way along a tunnel. Presently, he laid me down very gently, and I heard people talking in a strange tongue I could not understand. The young giant next wiped the sticky tree gum from my eyelids, and I was able to look around me. I sat up and saw that I was in a great, big cave. The floor was covered with animal skins, soft to touch and much better preserved than we preserve them. A small fire in the middle of the floor gave all the light there was. As my eyes became accustomed to the gloom, I saw that beside the young giant who had brought me to the cave there were two other wild people, a man and a woman. To me as a young girl, they seemed very old, but they were active and friendly, and later I learned that they were the parents of the young Sasquatch who had stolen me. When they all came over to look at me, I cried and asked them to let me go. They just smiled and shook their heads. From then on I was kept a close prisoner. Not once would they let me go out of the cave. Always one of them stayed with me when the other two were away. They fed me well on roots, fish, and meat. After I had learned a few words of their tongue, which is not unlike the Douglas dialect, I asked the young giant how he caught and killed the deer, mountain goats, and sheep that he often brought into the cave. He smiled, opening and closing his big, hairy hands. I guessed that he just laid in wait, and when an animal got close enough, he leapt, caught it, and choked it to death. He was certainly big enough, quick enough, and strong enough to do so. When I had been in the cave for about a year, I began to feel very sick and weak and could not eat much. I told this to the young Sasquatch and pleaded with him to take me back to my own people. At first he got very angry, as did his father and mother, but I kept on pleading with them, telling them that I wished to see my own people again before I died. I really was ill, and I suppose they could see that for themselves because one day after I cried for a long time, the young Sasquatch went outside and returned with a leaf full of tree gum. With this, he stuck down my eyelids as he had done before. Then he once again lifted me onto his large shoulder. The return journey was like a terrible dream, for I was lightheaded and in much pain. When we recrossed the wide river, I was almost swept away. I was too weak to cling to the young Sasquatch, but he held me with one big hand and swam with the other. Close to my home, he put me down and gently removed the tree gum from my eyelids. When he saw that I could see again, he shook his head sadly, pointed to my house, and then turned back into the forest. My people were all wildly excited when I stumbled back into the house. They had long ago given me up as dead. But I was too sick and weak to talk. I just managed to crawl into bed, and that night I gave birth to a child. The little one lived only a few hours, for which I have always been thankful. I hope that never again shall I see a Sasquatch. 2. This following, even more mind-boggling account was collected by Dr. Ed Fuchs from a native woman who was first cousin to the wife of Patrick, whose story is told in the account. Back around the turn of the century, 1885 to 1900, the Indians set up a fishing camp near Keller on the San Pole River, D on map, p. 26. In the evening the men would return, tired and hungry, to camp with their day's catch. The women would work all evening processing the fish and putting it on drying racks to dry. While cooking dinner, one of the women, a recent bride through bride purchase, took a kettle and went off after water. Minutes later, she was heard screaming. The men rushed to the scene but could only stand and watch as Skunk carried her off. They knew that Skunk was very vengeful, and if harmed, the captive may be injured, and the mountains would not be safe for any Indian. As she was carried away, the captive tore off and dropped pieces of her white slip, leaving a trail for the men to follow. She had been with Skunk all summer, or at least a couple of months, when the men searching for her on horseback saw her gathering wild potato roots. Skunk was asleep nearby. Upon seeing the men, she emptied her lap of the potatoes, crept quietly to them, leapt on one of the horses behind its rider, and thus escaped. Upon return to camp, all of the Indians immediately broke camp and hastily departed the area. During her stay with Skunk, the woman had gathered roots, etc., which they shared. Skunk eats anything that other people eat but lives primarily on roots such as that of the thule, tule, or cattail plant, which they gather, dry, and store in caves. They build fires with flintstone and steel hides from Indians, which they use for bedding and to cover the entrance to their cave. During her stay with Skunk, the woman became pregnant and bore a son named Patrick, who grew up on the reservation. Patrick's body structure was very different from that of other Indians, as his arms were very long, reaching about to his knees. He was very short, about 5 feet 4 inches tall. His mother was described as tiny, possessed a sloping forehead, a very large lower jaw, a very large wide mouth with straight upper and lower lips, and straight protruding teeth. He was kind of stooped, or humpbacked. His ears were elongated upwards, peaked, and bent outward at the top. He had very large hands and long fingers and is described as very ugly, although extremely intelligent. He attended school on the reservation, was very smart, operated a ranch in the area, died at about the age of 30, and is buried on the reservation. Patrick is described as a gentle man who never beat or mistreated his wife. He married easily, as he had a good ranch and was considered affluent. From this marriage to Laura's cousin were born 3 daughters and 2 sons. Both sons died at an early age. The 3 daughters were named, in order from oldest to youngest, Mary Louise, now about 65 years old, Madeline, and Stella. Stella died at a young age. Mary Louise lives near Omak. A couple of summers ago, Mary Louise spent several weeks with Laura. Mary had heard several times over the years that her paternal grandfather was a Skunk and sought verification from Laura. Laura revealed all to her, confirming that her father was indeed half Skunk. Mary Louise's physical appearance is relatively normal. However, both girls have wide mouths, look like split from ear to ear, protruding teeth, and squint eyes. But Madeline, who lives on the Washington coast, has other very distinct Skunk features, such as a sloping forehead, long peaked ears, etc. She is considered ugly by Indian standards and is an alcoholic, spending most of her time in taverns. Patrick's wife, mother of these girls, is Laura's first cousin. Redcap from English folklore. The redcap, or powrie, is a type of malevolent, murderous goblin found in border folklore. He is said to inhabit ruined castles along the Anglo-Scottish border, especially those that were the scenes of tyranny or wicked deeds, and is known for soaking his cap in the blood of his victims. Redcap is depicted as a short, thick-set old elf with long prominent teeth, skinny fingers armed with talons like eagles, large eyes of a fiery red color, grizzly hair streaming down his shoulders, iron boots, a pikestaff in his left hand, and a red cap on his head. When travelers take refuge in his lair, he flings huge stones at them, and if he kills them, he soaks his cap in their blood, giving it a crimson hue. He is unaffected by human strength but can be driven away by words of scripture or by the brandishing of a crucifix, which cause him to utter a dismal yell and vanish in flames, leaving behind a large tooth. The tale of a redcap in Perthshire depicts him as a more benign little man living in a room high up in Grantully Castle. He bestows good fortune on those who see or hear him. The redcap, familiar of Lord William de Soulis, called Robin Redcap, is said to have wrought much harm and ruin in the lands of his master's dwelling, Hermitage Castle. Ultimately, according to legend, William was taken to the Ninestane Rig, a stone circle near the castle, then wrapped in lead and boiled to death. Redcaps must kill regularly. If the blood staining their hats dries out, they die. Redcaps are swift in spite of the heavy iron pikes they wield and the iron-shod boots they wear. Outrunning a redcap is supposedly impossible. Fext from Slavic mythology. A fext is a mythical undead creature in Slavic mythology. Its origins are found in the terrors of the 30 Years' War, 17th century, in Central Europe. It is said that the fext is invincible to bullets, except bullets made of glass. Some of the great generals of that time were called fexts because of their assumed immortality. The common ritual to become a fetus requires that a child be born from its mother's womb in an amniotic cavity. The attached placenta is removed, dried, and stored. When the child is old enough, the preserved placenta is held, or sometimes sewn, under the child's left arm. In some cases, the child may immediately die and return as a fext, while in other cases, the child may continue with life as normal, only to return as a fext after natural death. It is also possible to return from death as a fext by use of dark magic or by making a pact with dark forces, such as in exchange for one's soul. The appearance of the fext is, for all intents and purposes, its appearance in life, beautified. One would be extremely hard-pressed to find an ugly or unattractive font. Their skin may be any color possible for their race, but it will almost always be clear, free of spots, blemishes, wrinkles, or scars. Their eyes may be any color but will always be bright and vivid, or deep and thoughtful. Their hair may be any length, texture, or color, but it will always be kink-free. They will almost always seem at the peak of health, beauty, and vitality. For this reason, when they are discovered as being undead, they are often mistaken, at first, for being vampires. However, a flower maintaining its beauty is not guaranteed. If their origins are brought about by the practice of dark magic, the results can be a bit sketchy. Though, typically, employing dark forces is successful to become a fext, there are cases in which consulting with a malevolent entity will result in being tricked. The resulting fext may lose his soul in the deal and still end up vulnerable to age or the decomposition of death. These are often mistaken, as time wears on, for being zombies. This is a true story that contains an old wives' tale from my gran, so it is exactly what it sounds like, and the truth of its accuracy is subjective to what the reader believes. The parts about my mom, Elle, and I are 100% true. We were about 8 or 9 the day Mum took Elle and I over the heath. It was a hot and bright day in the middle of the summer holidays. We had been collecting natural materials to make a collage when we got home, and Mum's rucksack was full of stray feathers, wild grasses, leaves, and twigs, and we were on our way home where Gran was making a cheese flan and salad for dinner. As we were all very hot and slightly tired, Mum decided that we would wade through the river instead of going back over the hills the way we had come. The thought of pushing my tiny wheelchair through the muddy-bottomed, weed-tangled river never seemed to faze my mom. She was a healthy, fit 26-year-old and knew the heath like the back of her hand. The river wasn't very deep at that part, so Mom tipped my wheelchair back, told Elle to hold on to the handle, and we went in. The water immediately soaked our clothes through, and Elle and I started to scream, giggle, and splash each other in sheer delight. Then we saw them. Weeds? Flowing with the current of the river, swaying back and forth like a woman's long, tangled, unkempt hair, and I got the distinct impression that what we saw could have been either thing. I glanced at Elle and instantly knew that she was having the same uncanny notion. The weeds started to curl around our legs and the wheels of my wheelchair, making our progress a little more laborious, and our previous screams of playful fun changed to moans and squeals of unease and disgust as we felt the weeds gently tugging at our legs. At no point did Mum ever look anxious or fazed by this experience. She just kept saying, "It's only water weeds, you two, come on, don't be silly, you've seen them loads of times." We finally reached the other side of the river, and as Mum dragged my wheelchair backwards up the riverbank, Elle climbed up it and sat down beside me. We both just stared silently at the river and the sea of green for what felt like the longest time, but in actual fact, was only 10 minutes, before walking the rest of the way home. That night, after a hot bubble bath and cheese flan salad, in our flannel pajamas and slipper socks around the fire drinking hot tea, we told Gran about our adventure. Our grandmother took a sip of tea from her mug and told us the story of Green Hair. She had been a real person, though her real name had been forgotten by Gran, conveniently, Elle and I thought. Anyway, she had lived in the village around 1912, before the area was built up and modernized and developed into what it has become. She was young and kind, with a pretty face and beautiful long blonde hair, a daughter of a gentleman farmer, and was deeply in love with a handsome, young soldier. They were to get married, but before they could, the Great War broke out, and her young man was called up to fight. He was killed by a hand grenade on the front line, and when she found out she was widowed before she'd even become a wife, she lost the will to live, and driven by grief-stricken insanity, she went to the same river that we waded through, and she threw herself in. The river was as wild as the land at that time, and by the time her body was discovered, it was blue, bloated, and half-eaten by fish. Her long corn-colored hair had become interwoven with the slimy algae and long strands of evil-smelling river weeds, which clogged and choked the bed of the river. In fact, the pathologist who performed the postmortem said that the body may have been found sooner if not for the dark green weeds that appeared to have curled around her limbs and torso, anchoring her corpse to the river bed for days. From that time onwards, it was said that that river was haunted, cursed, or both, anyway an extremely bad place. People claimed to see the spirit of the young woman kneeling beside the river and weeping bitterly. More commonly, people often saw the body of the girl floating on top of the water, with long green hair/weeds streaming out behind her, and so she was given the name of Green Hair. Elle and I asked Gran why we hadn't heard this story before. Gran just smiled and said because it was an age ago, even before she herself was born, and she moved to the area. The area was developed and built up, and the river was tidied up and reconstructed, and along with it, the tragic tale of Green Hair was lost in the stream of passing time. We didn't altogether believe Gran's morbid tale, but when Elle and I talked about it in bed that night, neither of us could dismiss the eerie feeling that we saw green hair flowing in the river that day. Appalachia. I read Ramp Hollow, The Ordeal of Appalachia by Stephen Stoll to understand the history of how Europeans settled the area. A large amount of the people who moved to Appalachia were Scots-Irish in the 1700s. English landlords technically owned the land, but they were hundreds of miles away and had no ability to cultivate the land economically. So there was an informal deal to let the Scots-Irish inhabit the area in exchange for fighting the Native Americans. This lays a folklore foundation of European that morphed over time as it interacted with the other peoples of the area, such as Native American tribes and enslaved and formerly enslaved people. The enslaved people contributed what is known as root and conjure work into this folklore mix. An example of a European myth that morphed over time is a figure known as Raw Head and Bloody Bones. In England he is called Tommy Raw Head, but in North America it is typically Raw Head and Bloody Bones. The English version lives under stairs, but the Appalachian version roams dark roads and woods. And there are versions of the story local to specific areas that are very different. For example, Raw Head and Bloody Bones was a witch's hog brought back to life to take revenge. This isolationism continues for hundreds of years, as large-scale farming wasn't achievable in Appalachia. This meant doctors and hospitals weren't widely available. People had to rely on folk healings and remedies to deal with illness. A somewhat sad example of this is simply surviving childbirth. If you were an Appalachian woman who gave birth and then had a daughter who delivered a child, you were called a grandmother woman. Granny women were given lots of respect because they had proved success in an undeniable way. Granny magic is the benign magic that these women might recommend. When the ability to mine coal happened, then the rest of the nation wanted to get involved in Appalachia, and that's when railways and paths through mountains opened up this area to the rest of America. Appalachians, used to hundreds of years of being ignored by the government, now had to balance the freedom of being left along with the conveniences of capitalism. With the Great Depression and the failing of some of these capitalist systems, a lot of people leaned back into their earlier ways and teachings. The Black Calf. The Black Calf is a form of black magic/witchcraft originated in Cambodia, believed to be casted by witches by taking a newborn calf, baby cow, or a stillborn cow, removed from the mother cow, and performing a ritualistic chanting so that evil spirits can possess the calf. The cursed calf, regardless of its natural color, will turn black as the night sky. The black calf usually appears at twilight after sunset and will destroy the villagers' crops. If the villagers attempt to harm the calf or even walk in its path, they will be haunted by the spirits possessing the calf or will develop strange illnesses that will eventually cause their demise. One true story tells the incident that occurred in the Body River within the province of Krackow in Cambodia, told by Vet Ngos, an 88-year-old elderly woman who lives in the village. Back in 1980, after the Cambodian genocide regime, there was an old woman whom the people in the village believed to be a witch. She was hated by all the villagers, not because of the rumors about her but due to her violent and abrupt behavior. One day, one of the villagers suddenly fell ill and mysteriously died. A few days later, another villager started to behave strangely, sitting and pulling out his own hair until his entire head was covered in blood. Luckily, his family realized he was cursed and performed a curse-lifting ritual, which saved his life. From that day on, the old woman was feared by all the locals, and unexplainable illness continued to plague the village. One evening, Ta Yok, an elderly man in the village, saw a black calf wandering into his property. Thinking it was just a normal baby cow wanting to eat his crops, Ta Yok threw his shoe at the calf. He then began to shake violently, and when his wife and kids checked on him, the man attacked them, causing his wife and kids to flee to the neighbor's house. The villagers described Ta Yok as having white eyes with no pupils, screaming, and speaking in an unknown language until he died without any apparent reason. The villagers then realized that his death must have had something to do with the black calf. Since then, whenever the calf appeared at someone's house, that house would have an unfortunate event occur. Vet Ngo's continued her story. One night, as she was lying in bed alone in her house, she heard an animal eating her crops in the backyard. At first, she thought it was just a pig or a stray dog, but she decided to light a lantern and went to check anyway. There, she saw the calf, black as midnight, eating her lettuces. The calf looked up at her as she stood there, terrified. It then jumped onto her, causing her to fall back to the ground. The black calf then grew fangs and unleashed a horrifying demonic screech before disappearing into thin air. It was unclear why the cursed calf didn't take her life, but Vet Ngos thinks it was because of the Buddha amulet she wore that night that protected her. The villagers gathered and decided that no one would approach or harm the black calf as it would not result in a good outcome. Many days after the village's surrender, the black calf disappeared without a trace. What's strange about this, however, is the fact that the black calf disappeared the same day the old woman, who was rumored to be a witch, moved out of the village. Vet Ngos remembers her encounter with the black calf, which still horrifies her these days. It is still a current belief in Cambodia that if you ever see a black calf wandering into your house, you must either pretend not to see it or not let it see you. Otherwise, your cursed soul will suffer misfortune. Dhampirs from Balkan folklore. In Balkan folklore, dhampirs are creatures that result from the union of a vampire and a mortal human. This union was usually between male vampires and female mortal humans, with stories of female vampires mating with male mortal humans being rare. In the Balkans, it was believed that male vampires have a great desire for women, so a vampire will return to have intercourse with his wife or with a woman he was attracted to in life. A Serbian widow tried to blame her pregnancy on her late husband, who had supposedly become a vampire, and there were instances of Serbian men pretending to be vampires in order to reach the women they desired. Bulgarian folklore sometimes claims that vampires also deflower virgins. The sexual activity of the vampire seems to be a peculiarity of South Slavic vampire belief as opposed to other Slavs, although a similar motif also occurs in Belarusian legends. Legends state that dhampirs were, for the most part, normal members of the community. But dhampirs, especially males of paternal vampire descent, could see invisible vampires and practice sorcery, often starting careers as vampire hunters, which would be practiced for generations from father to son. According to the legend, dhampirs are really similar to vampires. They have both the powers of a human and a vampire. They can sense a supernatural creature within a specified distance, have acute sense of sight and hearing, have regenerating abilities, immortality, walk in sunlight, which led to the adoption of the sobriquet Daywalker, and also eat like a human. Dhampirs can also control animals and can be used to destroy vampires. Don't mess with the fair folk and creatures. Any of them. They don't like interacting with our perceptions and lifestyles of modern-day life, let alone us in general. They love their privacy too. I imagine it's difficult to gain their favor unless a person lives and tends to woodlands and natural places like that regularly and frequently. They'll lead you astray and confuse your mind if they think you're bothering their business. I've been able to see a fair creature before. It was the year I really cleaned out the trails in the woods on shared property. I hadn't done it in a very long time and happened to see this creature at a distance that looked like a golden retriever times doe crossbreed on the second or third day out there. It had a shiny, golden coat that was thicker around the legs and the lower back. It looked completely different under the lens. Like those Irish wolfhounds. Before I'd leave offerings for the wood like big granite rocks and mineral stones I've collected in other areas. Though I'd stopped that for a while at this time. I was curious about it and decided to follow if it allowed me. It didn't, yet I pressed on. Nearly becoming lost in the woods I've been so familiar with for most of my life. I completely lost sense of thought and direction. Bringing up a map now, I was probably 400 feet in the woods. Nothing major. And I was in full enough health that day that there's no questioning the experience. I wasn't under the influence. I wasn't sleep deprived, I was inhaling wild gases, etc. While I don't believe I've ever seen a typical pixie or fairy or gnome out here, I have been in a few areas that felt like they definitely exist there. In those areas, it feels like being watched by dozens of tiny eyes. As if something were all around you remaining unseen. Checks out with what I read here. I've experienced this mostly in old creek beds, ditches, gullies, and yeah, this is an area where flint, iron sheets and ores, granite, gold, cuprite, black tourmaline, ocean fossils, etc. can be found if a person looks hard enough or simply tries with a bit of knowledge. The deeper the beds become, the more evidence of these resources are found. I'm at places like this regularly, exploring and discovering what nature uncovers next for my collection and general logs of what I've found and where. The fair creatures definitely reside around here. I often get what I call hobgoblins inside the house. You don't see them, you don't hear them, but they'll move your shit around and randomly put it back or make it easy to find again in odd places. Sometimes they find items for me if I ask the room politely and return back later, but mostly they're just moving them around. Not exactly sure why, maybe curiosity? The house type doesn't seem bad or good, just neutral. So, being that I have traversed the land throughout my life, I've had a few questionable happenings or encounters more fi-like than supernatural, but it really blurs the border between them both. I can't stress that enough. This next type of entity encounter better exemplifies what I mean by this. Ghostly spiritual wise and straight up physical cryptozoological, right in front of me sort of concepts. A bit like what the Fi are supposed to be like, I'd suppose, but these feel to be a different grouping in their own right. When I was young, I had two very different encounters with doppelganger/changeling type entities. For lack of a better coinage. Both of these people I knew. Both entities took near perfect form but behaved off. Like they didn't entirely know how to human in one way or another. One entity had the form of my father, and one entity had the form of my mother. Both entities were seen and encountered at different times but were close in location. The entity that took the form of my mother gave me feelings of deep dread, terror, and otherworldly horror, though it passed as her in appearance other than the odd curled grimace held on her face, so as a child I trusted that it was her and nearly fell for whatever trick this entity had ready for me. My mother had purposefully called out to me as I walked by the area after a long hike around the wood. She repeated herself, and her movements were similar to what people hear about in skinwalker stories. She kept trying to get me to go to her and follow her into a small building, making a repeating come here motion with her hand while saying so. It all seemed mechanical, emotionless, and hungry. Upon seeing her and all that time she did this, I felt a deep wrongness on top of everything else. I'd known my mother was elsewhere and not wearing the clothes that this mother had on, but the reality of it was so foreign to me I didn't know better. My feelings were my only reason to doubt this entity, so for a bit I just stood there really thinking about what I should do. Just before I'd originally stopped there, I felt the energy drain out of me, and my mind was a bit aghast. Literally bringing me to my hands and knees. With all my thinking and feeling, I decided while slowly walking towards this thing, nope, I don't know what's happening, and that's not my mom. Like it all just clicked in, and it knew in that same moment that I knew. I could see the change reflect in its face. Its eyes, its features, though alike to my own mother's, were purely menacing, evil, sadistic, twisted away from her true likeness. I can never be certain of this, but as I turned and ran with all I could even try and muster within me while under that spell, I think it bolted after me. Though the house wasn't too far away and I had made it inside, so I guess not? I don't see any way I could have ever outranked this thing. The one impersonating my father was a lot kinder. It had done nothing but approach me while weeding the flower bed one day and pointed out some wild herbs that it then taught me about being edible, which they are. I had no knowledge of them back then. It spoke very little, but when it did, it was pleasant. I don't really recall any of the conversation besides this, but it kind of just stood and lingered around while watching me. It gave off a pleasant, loving, caring vibe and didn't seem mechanical or stupid at all, just a bit distant and reserved. I don't even remember when it left or if I left first, just that at some point it was over and I was off doing something else. Since this is long already, I'll finish off sharing the original one I had wanted to share. As a result, we all know the concept of the rake. I think I saw one. As you can assume, I believe in both the paranormal/supernatural and cryptic, and obviously science and fact. The two go hand in hand. I'm a spiritualist with my own beliefs, including that of psychic abilities. Basically, I've had a number of abilities as far back as I can remember, they aren't and weren't always active. One of them is to see things in my mind's eye. I believe I saw this rake this way in reaction to hearing rustling in the hedgeline of a trail. The image was of an emancipated dark gray and leathery human or humanoid casually facing toward the wood but looking over at me as if I'd just been noticed from within the curl of briars. It was kind of short and kind of small, curled forward on itself on all fours. It's thin and lanky. It's been a while, and the image was fleeting. I believe its bones dramatically pushed the skin out, stretching it, and its spine had protruded from the back far more than a regular human, as if pushed, rejected from the body. The rat's skin kind of hued an undertone of blues, like how people have undertones. I don't believe it had eyes, but then again maybe it did. Either way, they just looked like deep and empty sockets where eyes should be. A wider space for them than needed, like this area was flattened out. I also want to say it had bits of hair on its head here and there and that its legs were unable to stand straight. They were muscular like a cat or dog, a bit behind the knees. Is it a thin stretch of tissues and skin? Anyways, while my clairvoyance isn't solid evidence, there is another reason why I believe what I saw to be true. Mind you, I half expected birds by the time I decided to actively look for what was causing the sounds, despite what had popped in my head, because that's what it normally is. Curious, watchful birds, and I don't attribute all my life to spiritual notations, so I didn't think anything of what had popped in my head. I just wanted to see birds. I was maybe 2 to 3 feet away from the sound, not seeing a damn thing anywhere. While it was a thicker area than normal, there were still plenty of visual gaps to view, and if what I had heard was an animal, especially a bird, that thing would have bolted. It slowly dawned on me, well gosh, I hear rustling where there is nothing, and that rustling moved as if it were an animated, living thing, just legit invisible. Yeah. I turned my ass out of there. Sadly, I had a long, uphill stretch ahead of me before I got home and all the foo king while this thing just stalks me through the hedge on the same side I originally heard it. Even in wide openings gapping hedges, and viewing the other side of a creek, and guess what? I saw twigs and leaves move with nothing there to move it, and trust me, I can differentiate the wind moving about the land versus actual movement. They have a large gap between them. I had this feeling, the knowing that this thing had no clue what the hell a person was. That's just it, and I think that's what saved me? Who knows, but anyway, please be warned to never lay actual physical eyes on the entity that be. It hates it, and it is very territorial. I believe I was lucky, and mine had been more scared of me than I was of it at the time. I'll end this with a speculation about my last entity. I believe they travel the same way bears do, with wide territories. Not usually sticking in the same place, but forever traveling. The Bennington Triangle. There is a place up in Vermont known as Green Mountain National Forest. It takes up around 50% of Bennington County, surrounding the Glastonbury Mountains at its center, and between the years of 1943 and 1950, several mysterious disappearances took place in its deep, dark forests. The disappearances became so prolific that the area took on a new name among frightened locals, the Bennington Triangle, due to some similarities with disappearances around the Caribbean island of Bermuda. Since that time, the disappearances became an entranced part of local folklore, and to this day, the area occupants warn against wandering alone in the Green Mountain National Forest. Before the 18th century, the Glastonbury area was mostly uninhabited by European settlers. The governor of New Hampshire chartered the town in 1761, and by 1791, just 6 families called the tiny community home. Yet today, merely 8 residents remain within the ruins of Glastonbury's ghost town. It enjoyed something of a boom in about 1870 when it became a logging town, and as many as 300 timber workers moved into Glastonbury to harvest the surrounding forests. But overlogging of the mountain decimated the trees and eventually led to the town's economic decline. Perhaps the logging damage to the habitats of the local wildlife led to the Native Americans believing that the new industry had disturbed and angered the spirits of the forest. Or maybe the Glastonbury curse was something entirely more menacing. However, it is tough to discern just how much of what people say about the Bennington Triangle is actually true. Details surrounding the various vanishing have varied over the years, even down to the particulars of those that actually went missing. But what is clear is that for eons before European settlers ever occupied the area, the local Native American peoples used the area as a burial ground for their dead. Believing that the spirits of their ancestors inhabited the forests and would curse anyone who strayed too far into the dark and isolated woods, they stayed well away from the area. But the same could not be said for those that traveled from across the Atlantic. One particularly eerie piece of folklore from the Abenaki tribe tells of a rock that ate the souls of all that passed near. To them, the woods were so devoid of the typical sounds of nature, such as birdsongs or the buzzing of insects, and many attested to such frightening sensations while hunting near the woods. However, there may well be some actual science behind such claims, as geologists say the area has an unusually large amount of sinkholes due to subterranean water erosion. But regardless, the list of those declared missing after venturing into the forests is long indeed, and these are just a few of them. In 1943, a man named Carl Herrick and his cousin, Henry, were participating in a hunting trip just 10 miles northeast of Glastonbury town. The story goes that one point during their trip, Carl walked off into the woods to relieve himself. Yet after some time, Carl still hadn't returned to the spot they were resting at, so Henry called out through the woods to him, only to receive no reply. For hours and hours, his cousin searched for him, but Carl was nowhere to be found. Over the following days, a search party scoured the woods for any sign of Carl Herrick, and eventually a body was found that was believed to be his. But his remains showed bizarre signs of having been crushed by some ungodly force, so badly that Carl's rib had punctured his lung, but there were no signs of anything that could have possibly inflicted such wounds. Henry is reported to have said that the search party found that there were large bear prints around the corpse. But a bear would not have squeezed a man to death, nor would it have left fresh meat to spoil like that, being the occasional scavenger animals that they are. Something must have severely spooked that beat if it left a corpse alone like that. Just 2 years later, in 1945, the Midi Rivers incident occurred. Midi was a very experienced and hardy outdoorsman, and very few people knew the forests around Green Mountain better than he did. But one day, Midi was heading up a hunting party in a place known as Hell's Hollow when he happened to stray a little too far ahead. Soon, it dawned on his fellow hunters that Midi was no longer with them, but none of the hunters showed any initial concern. After all, Midi was probably the most skilled hunter and tracker that any of them had ever known. It had to be just a matter of time before he found them again, yet no one ever saw or heard from him again. After a long and intensive search of the surrounding woods, the only trace of Midi Rivers was an empty rifle cartridge that matched up with the kind he was known to use. There was no blood or shredded clothing left behind, no evidence of an animal attack whatsoever, and his corpse was never found. But perhaps the most well-known of all the Bennington Triangle disappearances is the case of Paula Weldon. She was a sophomore student at the nearby Bennington University, and on the 1st of December, 1946, 18-year-old Paula headed out into the woods on a short hike intended to relieve the stress of her studies. Paula was wearing a light red jacket, not ideal for a lengthy hike in cold weather, so it is safe to say that she had not intended to be out for a particularly long time. She was last sighted by a couple out for a walk on a stretch of land known as Long Trail. They witnessed Paula turn a corner, but when they reached the same spot, she had inexplicably vanished from sight, and it would be difficult to miss such a bright red jacket among the dark foliage. The following day, when her classmates noticed her unusual absence, they informed the local police, who commenced a thorough search of the Long Trail. The search party was 1,000 strong at times and even included a number of light aircraft enlisted by the FBI. But still, not a trace of Paula was found anywhere. Paula was by far the most famous case, but the most tragic was that of 8-year-old Paul Jeffson. Paul's mother was employed by the local garbage dump, and on the 12th of October, 1950, Paul accompanied his mother to work since he was off school for the holiday. They didn't intend to stay long at all, so Paul's mother told him to stay put in the truck while she popped into the dump's office to complete a few pieces of paperwork. But when she got back to the truck, Paul was gone. Much like Paula Weldon, Paul was wearing a brightly colored rain jacket that would be almost impossible to miss on the backdrop of the surrounding woods. But when another huge search was mounted, which this time included sniffer dogs from the local police force, nothing was found. It was as if Paul had vanished into thin air. But analysis of local Abenaki folklore found a disturbing tidbit of information regarding the wearing of bright colors in the forest. Apparently, it is terrible luck to wear anything but dark shades while visiting Native American burial grounds, as it offends the spirits of the dead, a truly terrifying detail to consider. In the same month, October of 1950, a young woman named Frida Langer and her family were on a camping trip near the Somerset Reservoir, deep within the Bennington Triangle. Frida and her cousin Herbert set off on a hike around the area, but less than a mile into their little adventure, Frida tumbled and landed in a stream. But given they weren't all that far from their campsite, Frida turned back to get a change of clothes, while Herbert waited at the site of her accident for her return. After an hour or so of waiting, Herbie walked back to camp, outraged that his cousin would leave him waiting so long, but when he asked after her, he discovered she'd never made it back to camp. Her disappearance was completely unexplainable, and many puzzled over how a girl could possibly vanish over the course of such a short journey. And by this time, the number of inexplicable vanishings meant that the woods had garnered quite the reputation as being mysteriously but undeniably dangerous. It also seems like the power of the Bennington Triangle is not just confined to the woods. James Tedford, a veteran of World War II, was returning to his residence at a VA hospital in Bennington during 1949, after a visit to some of his family in nearby St. Albans. His journey was via a Greyhound bus that held no more than 14 other passengers, but somehow, when the bus arrived in Bennington, Tedford wasn't on board. Yet strangely, not only was his luggage still in the bus's rack, but personal items belonging to Tedford, including a jacket and his ticket, were sitting on his seat in his place. The other passengers were later questioned by police when he was reported missing. But not a single one reported seeing him disembark at any point on the journey. In fact, they had seen him sitting in his seat at every single scheduled stop, just not the one he was due to get off at, Bennington. Since Tedford's disappearance was yet another in a series of mysterious vanishings in the Bennington area, police were eager to get to the bottom of the case as quickly as possible. But logically speaking, they could only settle on one solid conclusion: that Tedford has never boarded the bus in the first place. But this stood in stark contrast to the fact that not only was his luggage on board, but he had been sighted by many of his fellow passengers. Like many of the other disappearances in the Bennington Triangle, Tedford's case remains totally unsolved to this day. But there must be practical, tangible explanations for such vanishings, even if they seem fairly outlandish. One theory centers around the intense, unpredictable weather patterns that the New England area suffers from. Professional hikers and mountaineers alike insist that the disappearances are down to nothing more than poor weather. Since wind patterns in the area can be incredibly erratic, even those familiar with the area could lose their footing in perilous situations or suffer from serious disorientation in some cases. However, although this might account for one or two of the missing persons, it certainly does not account for all of them. Many visitors to the area have also reported seeing cougars in the Green Mountain National Forest. These big cats can stalk hikers for long distances while waiting for an opportune moment to strike. Lone hikers are by far the most at risk, especially during the winter when the mountain lion's natural prey is scarce, which also happens to be when the majority of disappearances have occurred. Because they can weigh more than 200 pounds, a powerful cougar can subdue and kill someone very quickly. But a mountain lion would most certainly leave behind traces of their kills, be it bones or shredded clothing, and in most of the Bennington disappearances, not a single piece of evidence of the unfortunate souls has been found. However, another theory, one rooted in mental illness, is much more feasible. One story tells of a bizarre character by the name of McDowell moving to Bennington in 1892, looking for work at a local sawmill. The man was a solitary, quiet soul, brimming with malcontent, and was viewed with suspicion and fear by the other workers. Then, after a few months of floating from job to job, he got into an argument with a foreman and smashed the man over the head with a hammer before slaying another that came to the foreman's defense. The man was ranting and raving as local lawmen cornered him in one of the town's taverns, and once he was in custody, he was confined to an insane asylum for the foreseeable future. But the man was wild, violent, and cunning. And it didn't take long for him to escape the asylum and escape into the mountains to hide among their many caves and caverns. Some say the horrendous environment of the asylum and the callous abuse of the orderlies and doctors had turned him well and truly feral. And every so often, the man would descend from the mountains to terrorize the residents of the town, wearing only a long black coat with a pistol in his hand. McDowell may have been able to prey upon the town's residents during the early 1900s, but by the middle of the century, he will have been a much older man and may not have even survived in the wilderness for such a considerable length of time. Perhaps it'll never be entirely certain what is to blame for the bizarre disappearances in the Bennington Triangle. Be it the weather, wild animals or a deranged serial killer, the area is without a doubt one of the most inexplicably dangerous places in the entirety of the United States for those who are unlucky enough to find themselves alone among the trees there. And it is truly chilling to think that these disappearances might never be solved, that the fates of those poor souls might be forever kept a secret, hidden among the mountains and forests of the Green Mountain National Forest.